Chapter 680. Naturally, it was impossible for the 10,000 soldiers the Qing kingdom had sent to be stationed around Dongyi. Although this was the largest city in the world, it was not difficult for it to provide 10,000 soldiers with logistical tents. Due to some reasons that were difficult to explain, a new military camp, which should have been built in 5 days, had yet to be completed. Thus, a portion of the Qing army was only temporarily camped in temporary camps. In the end, 5,600 people remained on Dongyi's side. The rest of the people were stationed in various vassal states to suppress and intimidate. That night, after attending the banquet, the great prince was not in a hurry to rest. Instead, he gently waved his hand at Fan Xian. The two of them flashed into a quiet study. The great prince was silent for a moment. In the end, he first took out a letter from his clothes. Fan Xian glanced over and saw the style of the letter. He was about to kneel down to receive the emperor's secret edict when he was unexpectedly pulled back by the great prince. "It's just the two of us. There is no need for our knees to suffer." The great prince gently shook his head. Fan Xian was slightly startled. Shortly after, he slowly smiled and did not bow again. Accepting the emperor's secret edict from his hands, he opened the seal and read it carefully. He then sank deep into thought and did not speak for a long time. "I will return to the capital first. You will replace me here for 3 months." In the letter, the emperor's tone was very warm. There was an undisguisable admiration for Fan Xian. Fan Xian's mood was relaxed, so his tone was also relaxed. He said to the great prince, "This arrangement is possible. The problem is, when you return to the capital and I come pick you up, are the two of us going on an errand in Dongyi forever?" In order to conquer Dongyi as quietly as possible and let the Qing kingdom's financial and military power suffer as little damage as possible, the great prince and Fan Xian, the two sons of the emperor who had Dongyi blood running through their veins, were, without question, the best choices. Although Sigurd will during the opening ceremony a month ago had strongly pulled Fan Xian onto the path of the Dongyi people and pointed directly at the emperor's heart, the emperor was a wise man. How could he not understand this? On the contrary, he went with the flow and changed his original thoughts. He actually sent the great prince to lead the Qing army to be stationed. Regardless of whether it was the great prince or Fan Xian, they both had half Dongyi blood in them. This was an unparalleled weapon when it came to conquering the hearts of the Dongyi people. At least, the conquered people would feel much better every time they thought of the Qing nobility above their heads being half Dongyi. Particularly the great prince, he was a true prince. His birth mother's past was known to the world. Having him stationed in Dongyi could also represent the mixing of blood between the Qing kingdom and Dongyi. If one truly wanted to conquer a piece of land, the mixing of blood was, without question, the most powerful weapon. The emperor saw far into the future. However, it was impossible for the emperor to allow the great prince and Fan Xian to stay in Dongyi for a long time. He only had these two grown princes and needed them by his side to help with court and military affairs. His sons were too far away from Jingdo. The Qing emperor was also faintly worried about the two princes who clearly did not have much of the Li family heir. Fan Xian was well aware of this worry, so he was not surprised by the instructions in the secret edict. He only had a headache. The great prince had come and he was about to leave. What would he do in the future? Someone needs to be stationed in Dongyi. He looked at the great prince and asked, "What exactly does the emperor plan to do? Are you going to do it, or am I going to do it? I'm not sure either." A faint worry appeared between the great prince's brows. He was not a normal Qing official or commoner. Although he felt incomparable joy and shock at Fan Xian's ability to convince Sigurd to subdue the Sword Hut and swallow the land and people of Dongyi into the Qing kingdom's territory without a drop of blood, he was thinking more about whether or not this process would proceed smoothly. Although the Qing Iron Riders had effectively intimidated the hearts of most of the Dongi people outside Dongi, the behavior of the disciples of the Sword Hut made the great prince wary. He glanced at Fan Xian deeply and said, although the emperor did not say it explicitly regarding the Sword Hut, it is clear that he is not happy with this move. At the time, I was forced into a corner. Either I take over the Sword Hut or I start from the beginning. Fan Xian laughed coldly. Did you think I wanted to be a fatty piece of meat caught between hard buns? Father's intentions were clear. At the very least, you have to go back and report. The great prince furrowed his brows slightly. Shortly after, he sighed. I am only here to temporarily replace you. Father will not be at ease with me staying in Dongi for long. Fan Xian sank into silence. He knew the great prince was speaking from the bottom of his heart. The great prince had always had some care and closeness toward Dongi. After all, Lady Ning had been giving him orders for many years. Additionally, he had military power in his hands. The emperor would rather stay in Dongi himself than be at ease leaving Dongi to the great prince. It was not difficult to carve out land and make a king. What kind of land to carve out and who to make a king was the difficult matter. In any case, the emperor has not rushed me. I will stay in Dongi for a while and help you sort out the situation, Fan Xian said. After the situation has stabilized, I will return to the capital. The great prince nodded and then said, the Overwatch Council still needs you to manage it. Presumably, father will not always have you away from Jingdo. After you return to Jingdo, ask around and see what the future plans are for Dongi. You are worried that the emperor will send a powerful figure over and incite a civil revolt in Dongi? Fan Xian gazed at him with a slight smile. I have made arrangements here. As half a Dongi person, you don't have to worry too much. His tone became serious. Even if you are worried, you have to bury it in your stomach and not let others see. The great prince knew that his brother truly cared about him. His heart moved, he nodded. Is Qin Pingping preparing to leave? Fan Xian took a sip of cold tea and felt his mouth dry. He raised his gaze and glanced at him. This great prince had a close relationship with Qin Pingping. Presumably, he was well aware of what was happening in Qin Garden. He has already begun to make preparations. A few days ago, he went into the palace to ask for his resignation. The great prince did not know that Director Qin, whom he viewed as an elder, had once had treasonous thoughts toward his father. He did not see this matter as serious. He only thought that Director Qin was getting old and should retire. Thinking of how he would leave Jingdo and not knowing if he would see him again in this life, the great prince felt a bit lost in his heart. Fan Xian was silent. He calculated in his heart for a long time and then ignored this question. In the end, he asked, the troops coming to Dongi this time, are they truly all the Western Expedition Army? Can you completely control them? The soldiers are all old. The problem is that there are many strangers in the middle ranks, the great prince said coldly with narrowed eyes. In the next few days, he was still badly battered. The complicated handover and name-changing ceremonies happened everywhere in Dongi. Fortunately, the Ministry of Rites and Honglu Temple sent a large number of capable officials. Only then did Fan Xian not vomit blood because of these things. What truly battered him was a popular uprising in the Liang Kingdom to the northwest of Dongi. During the mobilization of the people to resist the Qing invaders, a Liang scholar who was deeply respected by the people self-immolated on the street. Black smoke rose and immediately ignited the hatred in the hearts of the Liang people. Only now did Fan Xian truly understand how childish his initial thoughts were. To truly conquer a foreign country, it was impossible to do so without bloodshed. The great prince had already led the army over to suppress it. Before he left, Fan Xian seriously exhorted that if it was possible for the Qing army to not act, then they must not act. Once the Qing army's hands were stained with the blood of the Dongi people, it would be difficult to wash it clean. This kind of hatred could never be resolved. The great prince followed the plan and sent a stern-worded letter to the manor of the master of the city in Dongi, rebuking the master of the city, Yunjilan. He then urged the manor to be the vanguard and the local martial power as the vanguard to suppress the unrest in the Liang kingdom. The Qing army was the rear and maintained a certain distance. After the great prince and Yunjilan both left Dongi, all affairs were handed to Fan Xian to handle. He hid by the seaside and thought of the never-ending sparks of fire in Dongi. He felt a wave of irritation. It should be better to have the manor of the city suppress it. It was probably like the puppet army in his previous life. Fan Xian sat on a large rock by the seaside and smiled bitterly. He knew that no matter what he did, no matter how Sigurd Qian's last words and the disciples of the Sword Hut cooperated with him, he still could not change the fact that in the hearts of the people of Dongi, he was an evil invader. How exactly do you want to deal with the matter of the Liang kingdom? 13th Wang, who had become more and more silent these few months, was sitting by his side. Suddenly, he asked, "Do you want the army to massacre the people?" The manor of the master of the city does not have an army. It only has the power and position that it has developed over the years. Fan Xian knew why 13th Wang was asking this. After all, he was a Dongi person. Yet, he had to suppress the unrest in the Liang kingdom that he saw as righteous. Presumably, his feelings were complicated. He paused for a moment and then quietly said, "I have orders to try to keep as few people as possible dead. In the end, people will still die. Furthermore, once the weapons move, how will you control them?" 13th Wang's gaze was confused. He only stared at the rise and fall of the waves on the ocean. Fan Xian tilted his head and glanced at him. His expression gradually became serious. "Do you know the scholar who burned himself to death?" In the past, Sergu often came to the Sword Hut to speak with the teacher, 13th Wang replied. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "There are many hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the world. Although I have never seen this Sergu, presumably, he is also a remarkable figure. The chaos in the Liang kingdom started because of him, but I am unable to deal with him. As for his family, don't worry. I will protect them. Sergu's ancestral hall will be built as soon as possible after the matter is over." 13th Wang looked at him in a daze. After a long time, he said, "You don't truly respect him. You just need to put on this attitude to appease the people of the Liang kingdom." "That's what all invaders do," Yi Zichen said. Fan Xian's expression was slightly dim. "However, I am surprised that you can think of this. 13th, you are becoming more and more remarkable. I've seen too many things. No one can be simple." 13th Wang stared into his eyes and said, "You once promised the teacher that you wouldn't let the people of Dongi bleed. I don't like to see blood. Otherwise, why would I be tied to this carriage by the Sword Hut?" Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. His smile gradually became icy. "But, necessary blood must be shed. Otherwise, if it continues to be chaotic, it will be like a whirlpool that will swallow all of Dongi. At that time, even more people will die." He turned his head and looked calmly at 13th Wang. "I know what you are angry about. I also know what you are sad about. Look at my eyes and think of what I have sacrificed. Don't forget, if you only consider it from the perspective of my own interests, if the Qing army attacked, I would be free and unfettered. At most, I would cry for the innocent people of Dongi. Why would I suffer like this? If the two sides start to fight, Dongi will certainly lose. The number of deaths will be in the hundreds of thousands," Fan Xian said with his eyes closed. Fan Xian closed his eyes and said, "My philosophy of life is very simple. Since this matter cannot be stopped, then the fewer people who die, the better. There is no difference between 10 lives and 10,000 lives, 13th Wang said. Wrong. Fan Xian said resolutely. I don't care if a life has a price. I only know that a person's life is unique. 100,000 unique lives are more important than 10, 100, or 1,000. If the heavens gave me a multiple-choice question, between 100,000 lives and 99,999 lives, I would certainly choose the former because there is one more in the former. The people of Dongyi should learn to be grateful to me. Fan Xian looked into 13th Wang's eyes and calmly said, I have allowed many people who should have died to live. 13th Wang was silent for a long time. He then said, but these people did not need to die. The emperor's cause requires them to die, so they must die. Fan Xian stood up from the large rock. Even your teacher was unable to stop him. You should understand the pressure I am under. Fan Xian patted the sand from behind his butt and narrowed his eyes at the endless ocean. Sometimes, I find that I am almost Gao de Quan. What is Gao de Quan? An inhuman description, Fan Xian shrugged. Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders. But, thinking about it carefully, I am not Gao Quan. I am just willing to do this. I will not die for some ideal or some spiritual need, such as burning myself like Mr. Gu. I am a person who knows how to run and is good at running. He then turned around and looked at 13th Wang. Calmly, he said, that day, Sigurd and I talked quietly in the room. You should have heard the contents of our conversation. Do you have any understanding of the tyrannical Zhenqi? Chapter 681. 13th Wang heard these words and thought for a moment. He didn't reply. Instead, he stood up in front of Fan Xian and slowly pulled out the sword at his waist. 13th Wang was not the green banner fortune teller who walked the world and experienced people's hearts. Rather, he was a swordsman who followed Fan Xian and refused to live alone. Fan Xian's expression became serious. His right hand climbed to his back and pulled out the Wei Emperor's sword. The light of the sword was like autumn water. It reflected the seawater not far away and rippled even more. Without any warning, the silent sword stabbed a foot in front of Fan Xian's face. This was the first time Fan Xian had truly seen 13th Wang use a sword. Only now did he understand why Sigurd had entrusted all of his legacy to this young man. Without question, 13th Wang's understanding of sword intent had reached a very high realm. With a thought, the tip of the sword arrived. It seemed to have already surpassed the restrictions of the environment. This was the terrifying realm brought about by the tenacity of one's heart. Once 13th Wang moved his sword, there were no stray thoughts in his heart. There was only this sword. The Emperor's sword in Fan Xian's hand was still pointed 45 degrees into the sky. He had no time to react. His face was pale. The tyrannical Zhenqi at the back of his waist exploded. Without any delay, he forced himself up. Like a seagull, he flapped his wings and glided toward the back of the beach. One slide was 150 feet. This was not a strange movement that a human should have. 13th Wang's sword was an assassin. The cold light at the tip of the sword slowly retracted. A sword mark appeared without reason on the beach in front of him. It was as if someone had walked by and a sword had passed by. It was a deep mark. The two of them were 150 feet apart. Fan Xian still held the Emperor's sword tightly in his hand. Suddenly, he had a feeling that 13th Wang's seemingly light and direct strike had a hint of the startling strike the shadow had made that day in the manner of the master of Dongyi. The shadow had gathered decades of cultivation and hatred. He stared in a daze at the silent 13th Wang. A moment later, he said, "What a tyrannical strike." As the words left his mouth, he realized his voice was a bit hoarse. Presumably, in order to avoid this simple strike, the Jinqi in his body had increased too much in a short amount of time and injured his lungs. Fan Xian took a deep breath. The pale complexion on his face gradually returned to normal. He glanced deeply at 13th Wang and said, pressing forward with indomitable will. This is indeed your method. Usually, you were not this fast or powerful. I've cultivated the tyrannical true qi, but I couldn't even pass the first stage. However, I've experienced the taste of this technique. 13th Wang's attack was ineffective. He slowly closed his eyes and said, I've already thought it through. I shouldn't bite off more than I can chew. I have the sword in my hand. Why should I learn the Qing Emperor's secret? The nameless art formula was too domineering, especially at the first checkpoint. His mind and body were completely separated, completely conflicting, and uncontrollable. It was too similar to qi deviation. Back then, Fan Xian had easily passed this trial because the last years of his previous life had all been spent in bed. He had long gotten used to being in a vegetative state where his entire body could not move and only his brain could move. Thus, Fan Xian was not surprised that 13th Wang had not stepped onto the path of the tyrannical martial formula. He was only surprised at 13th Wang's ability to comprehend. In such a short amount of time, he had sensed the dangers of the tyrannical martial formula. Furthermore, he had such high intelligence to immediately stop his search in this area. If I couldn't dodge that attack just now, would you have killed me? Fan Xian asked with slight mockery as the corners of his mouth twitched. 13th Wang was silent for a moment and then shook his head. He was a bit tired. He sat down directly on the slightly wet beach. That attack had appeared simple. It was just a basic bending of the elbow. To explode out with such speed and carry such a decisive stance, it had used up too much of his energy. In a short amount of time, it was impossible for 13th Wang to stab out a second time. It was just like how the shadow could only stab out that attack against Sigurd Jian in the manner. Fan Xian clearly understood this point. Slowly raising his feet, he walked toward 13th Wang's side. With a strange emotion, he said, many people say that one shouldn't bite off more than one can chew. Even you have such a clear judgment. Usually, I always thought that more skills did not weigh me down. Was I wrong? A faint trace of doubt flashed through his eyes. There are 4 great grandmasters in the world. In addition to my blind uncle, of the 5 ultimate skills, I have grasped 4. Even the Yi family's flowing cloud Sansho has been mostly grasped by me. He sat in front of 13th Wang and furrowed his brows. In the world, no, in all of history, I am the only one who has learned so many ultimate skills. Today, I was forced back by one attack from you. What is the use of learning so much? To be able to learn so much already shows that you are the most terrifying person in the world. 13th Wang's temperament was simple, but he was not like De Bao. He acutely sensed the sense of defeat gradually rising in Fan Xian's heart. Looking into his eyes, he said, any martial technique requires us to use our most focused thoughts in a lifetime to cultivate, practice, and perfect. Furthermore, it is an ultimate skill left behind by a great grandmaster. For you to be able to cultivate 4 of them to the extreme in a short period of 20 years is already shocking enough. Fan Xian had cultivated the ultimate skills of the 4 great grandmasters. In front of 13th Wang's attack, he had to temporarily retreat. Involuntarily, he thought of Sigurd Jian's realm and the Emperor's realm. A sadness that was difficult to suppress grew in his heart. 13th Wang looked into his eyes and quietly said, your ability to comprehend is very good, particularly with your strong foundations. Additionally, with such good luck, you should be the most powerful person in the world. My ability to comprehend is only average, particularly in front of you and Haitang Duo. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, all I can rely on is hard work. However, there is a limit to one's strength. Even if I were to work twice as hard as I am now, I would still not be able to break through that piece of paper. Fan Xian was able to easily dodge 13th Wang's attack that seemed to have come from the heavens. Additionally, he had long hidden the ultimate skills in his sleeves and body, particularly his sinister battle personality, and the ingenuity the Overwatch Council had given him. He was confident that no matter which 9th level ace he faced in the world, he would be able to defeat them. Even if it was 13th Wang, Hai Tang, Lang Tiao, or Yun Jilan, once they faced him, the one to die in the end would be them. After Yi Luyun left this world, regardless of whether it was power or personal cultivation, Fan Xian would, without question, be the second in the world. 13th Wang had also sensed this from Fan Xian's seemingly easy and casual slide earlier. A faint sense of awe rose in his heart. He looked at Fan Xian and still could not understand how a young man in his 20s could raise his cultivation to such a realm. The realms of the three young people in the world were similar. However, Fan Xian was more ruthless and had more tricks than the other two. How did you retreat that time? 13th Wang asked him with narrowed eyes. Fan Xian was silent for a long time and didn't reply. He only turned his head back and stared at the gradually rising and falling white waves on the ocean. He had already stayed in Dongyi for a long time. The booklet Master Ku he had left behind was deeply imprinted in his mind. Each time he meditated by the seaside, those words would pour into his mind. Although he still didn't understand most of the meaning, miraculously, as long as he thought about it, it seemed that there were minute factors inside and outside of his body that began to resonate with each other. His body became lighter, and his movements became faster. The recovery rate of the Jinqi in his body also increased. It was as if there truly was a kind of invisible and untouchable Yuanqi in the world that was willing to follow his thoughts to replenish what he had lost. However, this kind of replenishment made his heart palpitate. Was this the magic of the West? Humans would always have a fear of things they did not know of. What made Fan Xian even more indifferent was that the changes the little booklet brought him were not enough to solve too many problems. The speed of replenishment was too slow, and the increase in realm was too small. It seemed that the second in the world could only ever be the second in the world. For a moment, Fan Xian even wondered if he had made a huge mistake. Regardless of whether it was Master Ku He, Sigurjian, Yi Luyun, or the Emperor, these people at the top of the world were far above him in terms of willpower and diligence in cultivation. However, these great grandmasters only cultivated their own unique skills and never had their heart set on anything else. He had learned too many things and knew too many things. It was too messy. Fan Xian had a feeling that it would probably be easier for 13th Wang and Duo to break through that piece of paper than him. This was probably the intention Sigurjian had spoken of. His intention was still not as firm as those two people. Because he was too afraid, he did not care about the price to find a way to make himself stronger. Perhaps this kind of purposefulness was inferior, but he was truly afraid. He was afraid of death. He was afraid of the people he cared about dying. I am returning to the capital the day after tomorrow. A slight smile suddenly rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. As long as Dongyi does not fall into chaos, at least the world is still peaceful. Why should I worry about so many things? Dongyi belonged to the Qin kingdom. Although there were waves of unrest, with the suppression of the Qin kingdom's powerful military power and the cooperation of the upper echelons of Dongyi, it was impossible to raise any major waves. The emperor's trust in Fan Xian remained. Chen Pingping was about to leave the capital to retire. Thinking of this, Fan Xian stood against the sea breeze and felt very comfortable. Regardless of whether or not Uncle Wu Zhu would return, it seemed that as long as they followed this trend, he and the emperor would always be able to find a second path. Bloodshed was not necessarily necessary. Bloodshed was necessary. When the autumn wind began to pass through the small hills behind Dongyi, Fan Xian had finally taken care of most of the affairs in Dongyi. By the time the great prince and Yunjilan returned, the first major turmoil after Dongyi's surrender was finally extinguished within the borders of the Liang kingdom with the cooperation of both sides. The flames that had been lit by the self-immolation of the great scholar, Sir Gu, were quickly extinguished by the blood and were unable to spread for long. Over 400 people died in the Liang kingdom. These hot-blooded Dongyi people unfortunately lay in pools of blood. Fan Xian read through the general memorials and gave some instructions to the great prince. He then boarded the carriages leaving Dongyi. He was once again returning to Jingdo to debrief. Conquering a piece of land brought about daily nervousness, busyness, and killing for these expeditionary officials. After the great prince parted with Fan Xian, he led the garrison troops and coldly watched every movement in Dongyi. At this time, he and Fan Xian both felt that the general situation was set. If they continued to slowly struggle like this, regardless of whether it was the Qing court or the general situation of the world, they would all be within a controllable range. Thus, the two brothers were in good moods. In the crisp autumn air, their hearts were incomparably refreshed and had thrown away all their worries. Fan Xian could even temporarily not think about the problem of 10 family village and the problems of the past. As for the popular man in court, He Zhongwei, in his eyes, he was just a clown and could not affect anything at all. Today was a good day. These few days were rare good days in Fan Xian's life. The Black Overwatch Council carriages left Dongyi and slowly made their way back to the capital. Fan Xian was not in a hurry to return to the capital. Looking at the golden, slightly yellow, and deep yellow leaves around him, as well as the autumn mountains that had been painted into an oil painting, was also a rare enjoyment. Of course, blood continued to flow non-stop along the way. As a powerful official of the Qing kingdom, the master of the sword hut, the representative of the invaders, and the Qing emperor's favorite illegitimate child, Fan Xian became the emperor's favorite. On his way back to the capital, Fan Xian became the first target of the volunteer armies of the vassal states around Dongyi and the rebellious people. Perhaps it was not appropriate to call them rebellious people. They were righteous people. Most of the righteous people in Dongyi refused to accept surrender and bravely entered the mountains to fight the Qing invaders. Most of the people in Dongyi who refused to accept surrender and bravely entered the mountains to fight the Qing invaders were people of the Jianghu. These people, who had martial strength, were clearly more direct when it came to protecting their own moral principles. No one knew how these people found out when Fan Xian left Dongyi and grasped the route of the Overwatch Council carriages back to the capital. Along the way, they began to launch assassinations and even suicidal attacks on the powerful Qing officials in the black carriages. After arriving in Yanjing for about 20 days, the black carriages had been attacked 7 times. The troops from Yanjing and the Black Knights stationed at the border had not come to receive them. The great prince had only given Fan Xian a 1,000-man army. Thus, dealing with these 7 major attacks was rather difficult. Fan Xian no longer had any interest in admiring the scenery. Instead, he sank deep into thought. His personal safety was not a problem. The attacking volunteer armies often had no choice but to retreat after leaving behind countless corpses. However, his subordinates, especially the great prince's Western Expedition Army, had also paid a great price for this. Because they had sunk into a non-stop attack, the top-secret council reports from Jingdo had not arrived for 3 days. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked west with narrowed eyes. He silently prayed for Jingdo and the people he cared about to be safe. While Fan Xian was traversing through the mountains, within the Qing kingdom's borders, there was also a long group of carriages moving through the lonely night. This group of carriages was also pure black. In the very wide carriage in the middle, there was an old man with a woolen blanket covering his knees. His gaze was slightly turbid. Looking at the night road, he felt that this road seemed to never end. The former director of the Overwatch Council, the person who had secretly controlled the Qing Kingdom's dark powers for decades, the Qing Emperor's most loyal official, the most hated enemy of the Qing civil officials, the old thief that northern Qi and Dongyi people feared the most, and a major figure who had once influenced the entire situation under heaven, Sir Chen Pingping had finally embarked on his journey to retire. This time, he was not leaving Jingdo to return home to visit his family. He was returning home to settle down. First-class merit, countless rewards, and returning home to retire was a rare honor the emperor had given this old dog. All of the Qing civil officials thought so. Chen Pingping's home was to the east of the Qing kingdom. If one looked at it from a map, it was below Dongyi. However, it was a great distance from Danzhou and Jiaozhou. On the contrary, it was closer to Jiangnan. It was an impoverished area that was not very developed. The solitary group of carriages returning home was still far from home. Today, the group only passed through Dazhou. This was a province that Chen Pingping had to pass through on his way home. The group of carriages did not notify the officials along the way to avoid startling all of them into coming out in fear and trepidation to kowtow to the old director. However, Dazhou was brightly lit today. The bailiffs of the government were busily searching for something under the strict scolding of the Ministry of Justice's officials. Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes. He didn't remember any important figure in Dazhou. He lifted the curtain and summoned an unfamiliar official beside him. In a quiet voice, he asked a few questions. The official's face was unfamiliar, but there was a craftiness in his eyes that came from understanding the affairs of the world. He smiled warmly and replied, "When the commissioner returned to the capital, we had arrived a long time ago." Chen Pingping hummed tiredly, but a complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. He thought of the conversation he had with the emperor in the royal palace before he left Jingdo. He had already seen the deepest meaning in the emperor's heart. Chapter 682. Many years later, when the Overwatch Council began to comb through the major event in the early autumn of the 10th year of the Qing Kingdom, there were still many questions that could not be explained clearly. When Director Fan Xian returned to the capital from Dongyi, he was ambushed by the Dongyi volunteer army. Was this news purposely released by someone in court, or was it just a coincidence? After all, it seemed that only a high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council could know the little duke's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Dazhou, the place where Ol Amos was on his way home to retire, happened to be brightly lit and filled with murderous intent. Was this a coincidence, or was it God's will? Perhaps it was the latter, but at that time, the sky had long changed color. The intelligence officials of the Second Bureau of the Overwatch Council did not pursue the matter closely. At least, the officials of the Ministry of Justice handling official business in Dazhou did not know that at the time, there was a long line of black Overwatch Council carriages outside the city. No one knew that Director Chen, whom all the court officials regarded as a ghost and feared, was in the carriages. They had only received secret orders from their superiors and spent more than a year chasing after a criminal. As for the criminal's name, no one knew. All the clues they had were the criminal's martial skills and habits, as well as the appearance he had used. As for what the criminal had become in these 3 years, no one knew. Perhaps this was the will of the heavens for Chen Pingping to encounter the encirclement in Dazhou. It was also because Chen Pingping had comprehended the will of the heavens that he had stopped his journey home in Dazhou and returned to Jingdo, where he should have stayed for the rest of his life. Everything about Florida started more than a month ago, and it wasn't just about Florida. At that time, Fan Xian was still by the seaside, thinking hard about the will Sigurd Jian had imparted to him and the little book Master Ku he had left behind. He experienced the nature of the tyrannical Jinqi in his body and guessed whether or not the emperor's cultivation of the tyrannical martial method would create an unbearable burden on his body. He was watching the waves rise and fall, thinking that everything in the world was the same as yesterday, that the spring flowers had already bloomed, the autumn moon was hanging high in the sky, that he was the second most powerful man in the world, feeling proud of himself, thinking that nothing was difficult, that everything could be solved. However, the world had already undergone subtle changes at that time. That day was the beginning of July. The entire land was enveloped by the hottest sun of the year. Jingdo in the Qin kingdom was no exception. The third prince, Li Qingze, was reading a book with both hands. Beads of sweat dripped from his delicate face. Back then, he had been the youngest brothel owner in the world. After experiencing the rebellion in the palace and countless bloodshed, he had finally transformed his unconcealable ruthlessness into a steady and firm will that did not match his age. The third prince, Li Qingze, had already become a young man who treated people with courtesy, filial piety, and a young man who no one could find too many faults with. There were two people who had caused him to change so much in a short 5 or 6 years. One was his father, and the other was his teacher, his elder brother, Fan Xian. When facing the emperor, the third prince was careful and could not make any mistakes. It was a blood-like truth. The deaths of the crown prince's elder brother and second brother made Li Qingze understand very well what a terrifying existence his father was. Although these two brothers had once tried to kill him in the later years and their deaths were a good thing for Li Qingze, when facing his father, he still couldn't stop a chill from spreading out from his heart. Because he was afraid, he was respectful and cautious, so he could not make any mistakes. During these 3 years, Li Qingze had even seen less of Fan Xian. He only shut himself up in the royal palace. Occasionally, he could find out through his mother what the teacher had done. Li Qingze was also afraid of Fan Xian, his elder brother who could not be announced to the public. In the most important days of his adolescence, he had always followed Fan Xian and watched as Fan Xian, as an official, started a war between Jiangnan and the nobles in Jingdo and obtained the final victory. The pointer in Fan Xian's hand and cold gaze made him even more afraid to make any mistakes. Fan Xian's true influence on the third prince was that he let the third prince know what he was going to do in the future and what he was going to become. Only then did he truly change his personality. The third prince, Li Qingze, was destined to become the emperor of the Qin kingdom. The entire world was his, so he had to treat the world better. He was no longer like in the past, spending so much sinister thoughts to steal for the sake of some silver and realistic and short-term benefits. The world is mine, and it will be mine. Why should I torment it? This was the creed Fan Xian taught the third prince, and the third prince deeply believed it. The serving girl, Xing was gradually getting older. The young and inexperienced girl had gradually matured and developed a moving beauty. Xing was at the side fanning the prince. She watched with furrowed brows as the prince continued to read while sweating. She couldn't help but feel a bit of pity in her heart. Yi Guipin was chatting idly in Lady Ning's palace. There were not many idle people in Shufang Palace. Xing looked at the prince's handsome young appearance. Her gaze gradually grew distant. Li Qingze clearly felt this gaze. The corners of his lips twitched into a smile. He didn't make any reaction. He only gently placed his hand behind his back and pinched the tip of Xing's finger. His smile was very similar to Fan Xian's. "Do you want to rest first?" Xing's face reddened slightly. "It's such a hot day, and the emperor won't be coming." Li Qingze shook his head seriously and said in a quiet voice, "These are all on the list of books Sir made. Most of them are classics he dragged back from northern Qi. I have to finish reading them this year and write notes for him to review." He smiled bitterly and said, "If I don't pass, mother will beat me again." Xing bit her lip and said, "The Duke is in Dongyi right now. He doesn't have time to worry about so much." After the Jingdo rebellion was quelled, Although the emperor did not remove Fan Xian's identity as a teacher, Fan Xian rarely went alone to see the third prince. The third prince also did not often cause trouble and leave the palace. The two brothers both knew that the third prince was the true heir to the Qin kingdom. The emperor would not want this heir to grow up under Fan Xian's education. He would rather be taught by himself. In order to avoid this taboo, the two of them could only reduce their meeting. Although Fan Xian rarely came to Shufang Palace, he still did not stop training the third prince in his studies. When he was in Jiangnan, Fan Xian had already told the third prince many stories. During these 3 years, he still made many lists of books and requested that the third prince read them all. Other than being busy with official business, Fan Xian would also find time to look through the third prince's reading notes. For him, this was of the utmost importance. If the future of the Qin kingdom was placed on Li Qingze's shoulders, he hoped that Li Qingze could become a benevolent ruler. Even if he did not have any great ambitions, he would at least be able to look after his family business well. Every year during the new year, Fan Xian's family would enter the palace. That was the time he looked through the third prince's homework. Often, the whistling of the pointer could be heard in Shufang Palace, as well as the third prince's painful cries. Xing Er's expression was not normal. It was clear that she had become Li Qingze's first woman after he came of age. Of course, Li Qingze was also her first woman. Hearing Sir Fan Jr.'s name, Xing Er's eyes became unbearable. She said unhappily, "Sir Fan Jr. is also like this. He always strikes and doesn't pay attention to propriety at all." When Fan Xian had first entered the palace, it had been her who had taken him everywhere to visit. After these years of interaction, Xing Er did not feel that the incomparably powerful Sir Fan Jr. outside the palace was anything to be afraid of. She only felt that he was still the delicate and pretty young man from back then, so her words were not very respectful. Li Qingze was very afraid of Fan Xian. With a pained expression, he said, because of this, he dared to talk back to father. Mother is also standing on his side. What can I do? Although he said this, he did not bear any grudge. On the contrary, he was faintly lost in thought. He sighed and said, "It's been a long time since I've left the palace. I wonder how the matter in Dongyi is going." Speaking of this, even Xing Er's face couldn't help but light up a little. She smiled and said, "With Sir Fan Jr. taking action, what can there be that can't be done? Word has been going around in the palace that the Dongyi matter has been settled. The great prince will immediately lead troops over." The third prince naturally knew of the most important matter in the court. Thinking of how the teacher had performed such a great service for the court, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He nodded and said, "It would be great if I could go as well." A sense of longing suddenly appeared on the youth's face. The happiest days of my life were actually 2 periods outside the palace. One was when I was managing Baoyue brothel with Xijia. The other was when I was taken to Jiangnan by Sir. I don't know when I will be able to leave the palace again. In the process of anyone's growth, they would always unconsciously seek out a powerful person of the same sex as their goal and target to imitate. Even the princes born in the royal palace were no exception. However, they matured much earlier than the youth of the common people. When Li Qingze was in the beginning stages of puberty, there were 2 large mountains in front of him that he needed to look up to. One was his father, and the other was Fan Xian. However, the Qing emperor's power carried a coldness that kept people away and his family away. It was Fan Xian's power that truly had a bit of smoke and fire. It carried a stubborn, simple, and direct closeness. Thus, the third prince missed Fan Xian very much. A voice came from outside Shufang Palace. Before it could be sent, a head eunuch had already bent over and entered the inner palace. Xing Er furrowed her brows and glanced at the head eunuch. She gently bowed behind the third prince, not daring to be lacking in etiquette. The person who came was Eunuch Yao, the head eunuch in the royal palace and a close official deeply trusted by the emperor. Li Qingze narrowed his eyes and glanced at him. He felt it was strange. He didn't know what matter required him to personally come here. Eunuch Yao, what is it? Eunuch Yao was a person who knew his limits. Although he was the emperor's trusted aide, he knew that the third prince he was facing was one of the only two men in the palace and the future emperor. Thus, he properly bowed before evenly saying, "There is an old case being investigated in the internal court. There are some matters that are related to your highness, so I had no choice but to come and disturb your highness." Li Qingze's pupils constricted slightly. Without question, he was a clever person. From these words, he had gleaned a lot of information. An old case. Related to him. He had lived in the depths of the palace for many years. What kind of case could truly touch him? Furthermore, what kind of case would disturb him? Baoyue brothel. Impossible. Back then, Fan Xian had used this matter to cripple the second prince. It had been with the emperor's approval. Now, he could not bring it up again. Furthermore, given his present identity, no one would have the courage to bring it up. The light in Li Qingze's eyes dimmed slightly. He knew what the internal court was investigating. 3 years ago, there was a rebellion in Jingdou. The palace was in chaos. The third prince, Yi Guipin, and Lady Ning were all placed under house arrest in Hongguang Palace. At such a critical moment, someone in the palace wanted to assassinate Li Qingze. If he did not have the poison dagger Fan Xian had personally made, he would probably have died a long time ago. Afterward, there were some doubts about this matter both inside and outside the palace. At the time, the crown prince had already controlled the situation in the palace. Why would he do such an unreasonable thing? People also thought it was the second prince who did it. In the investigation afterward, they did not find any connection. Li Qingze's own memory of the matter was particularly deep. He also wanted to find out who wanted to kill him. However, the Overwatch Council investigated for a long time and could not find any clues. Fan Xian had once told him in private to stop investigating this matter. Thus, the third prince suppressed the anger in his heart and no longer paid attention to it. He knew that the teacher must have caught wind of something, which was why he did not continue investigating for him. Yet, the internal court was investigating this matter now. Concern for his own safety, anger toward the murderer who wanted to kill him, and trust in Fan Xian struggled for a moment in the third prince's mind. He made up his mind and shook his head. "I was quite frightened that day. I don't remember anything. Would I trouble your highness to come with me to draw a portrait?" After the two eunuchs were killed by Li Qingze, their bodies were quickly burned in the chaos. Too many eunuchs had died in the palace rebellion that day. Even now, no one knew who the third prince's assassin was. Eunuch Yao glanced at the third prince and spoke respectfully. Li Qingze's brows furrowed. He sensed something strange. "I still need to read. Since I am fine, don't worry about such a small matter." "How can that be? Your Highness is a member of the royal family. How dare someone have thoughts of disloyalty toward your Highness? The Emperor is furious and has ordered a thorough investigation." Li Qingze narrowed his eyes and looked at Eunuch Yao. He wondered what his father wanted to do now. If he was truly furious, then what had he been doing these 3 years? At the beginning of July, the third prince, Li Qingze, began to think back to the palace rebellion and the appearance of the two eunuchs who wanted to kill him. That night, the young mistress of the Jingdou government was lost in thought as she watched the two approaching stars in the sky. She knew that her father's days had been much better. With the little duke's help, no one in court dared to target the Jingdou government again. Even the popular man of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, Sir He Zongwei, had not been as ruthless as before. He was only quiet. Thinking of Sir Fan Jr., she couldn't help but think of the condition he had promised her during the Jingdo Rebellion. A light smile gradually rose to the corners of her lips. Chen Garden was bustling. Chen Pingping was making preparations to return to his hometown. None of the beautiful concubines in Chen Garden were willing to leave as he expected. Instead, they cried and shouted that they wanted to follow him back to his hometown and send him off. While the old cripple was puzzled and helpless, he couldn't help but think that perhaps when they looked at Fan Xian, they were not looking at cucumbers. Rather, they already had cucumbers. In the Fan Manor in the south of Jingdo, Lin Wan, and Cici were holding a pair of children and feeding them. A few nannies and serving girls were chatting to the side. The wife of the Ting family was in front of the steps reporting in detail on this year's harvest in the Fan Manor. In one of the 3 study rooms in the back garden, the Hangzhou Conference's accounting masters were waiting to report to their mistress on the amount of silver they had spent in the Jiangnan and Jiangbei areas to help the people. Lin Wan handed the bowl of porridge to a nanny and kissed Xiao Hua and Fan Liang on each cheek. She then walked to the door and stretched. Her actions were indeed not like that of a young mistress. However, Fan Xian spoiled her, so she was used to spoiling her freedom. She looked at the multitude of stars in the sky and thought of Fan Xian far away on the shores of the East Sea. Involuntarily, she tilted her head slightly, thinking that everything was on the right track. If she was going to leave Jingdo to live a carefree life, where should she choose? Danzhou or Dongyi? She suddenly remembered that she had never been to Dongyi and couldn't help but want to go. As she thought this, Fan Ruoruo, dressed as a doctor, pushed open the courtyard door with a medical box on her back and walked in. Behind her were a few servants who were anxious to take over the heavy items. Fan Ruoruo had returned from the countryside. Seeing her sister-in-law standing in the doorway, she couldn't help smiling and making fun of her. In the distant Northern Qi royal palace, the Northern Qi emperor sat on the jade platform in the main hall. She looked at the white sand in the pool beside the platform and the pair of fish lying on the sand. Her faint gaze was still lost in thought. By her hand were a few memorials. They talked about the circumstances of Sigurd Jian's death and the inside story of the agreement between Dongyi and the Qin kingdom. Logically speaking, the secret of this agreement was not something the Northern Qi brocade guard could find out. It was clear that the man had purposely leaked the information to her. The Northern Qi emperor narrowed his eyes. For the first time in his life, a perplexed expression appeared. He didn't know what his country or his future would be like. The current situation seemed to be clear. There was no opportunity for the conflict between Fan Xian and the Qing emperor to explode. What should Qi do? If this had been in the past, perhaps he would have long made up his mind to have Fan Xian and the Qing emperor fall out at all costs, even if he had to pay half of the national treasury's income or pay an endless price. Now, his thoughts had changed. He knew the power of the words Fan Xian had once said. On that day at the beginning of July, the people of the land all experienced some ordinary or unusual things. A turning point in history, an event that caused the details of history to change, did not happen in Jingdo or Shangjing. Instead, it happened in a remote province in the Qin kingdom. This should have been a routine public security check. The bailiffs walked slowly under the hot sun, occasionally hiding in the shadows of the shops along the street to rest. Gouda, who had hidden his identity for 3 years in disguise, was busy at a noodle stall on the corner of the street. There was a healthy flush on his face. It was no longer as determined as it was in the past. Instead, it was filled with ease and satisfaction. The hand that used to tightly hold a long knife now easily held a long chopstick. With great skill and dexterity, he picked up noodles from the pot and placed them into a bowl. He sprinkled some qinggu on it, and the fragrance rose. After escaping from Dong Mountain, Gao had wandered through the various provinces of the Qin Kingdom. The Qin Kingdom's strict household registration system and customs clearance document system had made him suffer greatly. Although no one had discovered his identity, it was still difficult for him to settle down to a stable life. He was a tiger guard of the royal family. He had not experienced much. He had no knowledge of the jianghu at the bottom of the common people. Once this tiger guard wandered into the shallows, it became very difficult for him. Later, by a lucky coincidence, he landed in Dazhou. He finally had a completely new identity. He opened a noodle stall on this street. Every day, he basked in the sun and cooked noodles. He even brought back a wife and a son. Perhaps this was true happiness. A wife and a child had a heated bed. Every day, Gao packed up his stall and came home to hug his wife, who made him feel hot all over. He even felt that even if he didn't use his knife, it wouldn't be a pity. Of course, he was still cautious. Although he had learned over the years that the court had probably decided that all of the tiger guards were dead, he still didn't let the court know of his existence, particularly the internal court. As a tiger guard of the internal court, he knew that secretly escaping was a great crime of deceiving the monarch. Once caught, it would result in the execution of his entire family. He continued to pay attention to Fan Xian's movements. Fortunately, Fan Xian was the most famous person in the Qin Kingdom. The discussions in the marketplace were always about Fan Xian. Thus, he knew that the commissioner had been living well these 3 years. Furthermore, he had made many contributions to the Qin Kingdom. It was even possible that he could bring Dongyi into the map. Gao was very happy. After drinking a few times, he felt that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed very powerful. However, he still did not think of going to find Fan Xian and think of a way to get rid of the crime on him. He felt that he was living well now. There was no need to change anything. Chapter 683. The mountains were high, the emperor was far away, and the people in the countryside were cruel. In the present Qin Kingdom, all of the officials were under the powerful supervision of the Overwatch Council. However, the Overwatch Council was, after all, a somewhat deformed organization. It was impossible for it to control all the joints of a feudal dynasty from top to bottom. The lower it went, the more remote it was, the more despicable the faces of the officials, the privileged class of officials, became. Dazhou was a remote province. Although the bailiffs and officials here could not be said to be like wolves and tigers, it was clear that they were not good people who loved the people. Particularly on such a hot summer day, when the sun made the bailiffs sweat, it had also sunk away much of their rationality. In addition to the 1.5 kilograms of beef and 20 grams of white wine, the alcohol roasted the bailiffs' hearts. They left the small wine beach and came to the noodle stall. With a smile, they stared at the beautiful female boss and began to drool. Teasing a woman in public was not something normal bailiffs and officials would do. If this had happened in the past, these bailiffs would probably have just looked and let it go. For some reason, they could not move their feet. The words in their mouths began to become dirty. A few of them, whose faces were red from drinking too much, had the intention of asking the woman in the noodle stall to keep them company. It was all because the yellow wine was too easy to drink, the white wine was too strong, and the woman in the noodle stall was too delicate and pretty. Gao married a wife in Dazhou. He had never told her what happened in the past. He just lived his life peacefully. Sometimes, he felt that the heavens were indeed looking out for him to have given him such a beautiful wife at the beginning of the second half of his life. She was a widow, mute, and had a son. Even so, Gao still felt that he was very lucky. She was a famous beauty in Dazhou. In Gao's eyes, she was not much worse than Sea Lily, who had been sent to northern Qi. Furthermore, she was very gentle, virtuous, and good, so good that he didn't know what words to use to describe her. In order to hide his true identity, Gauda should not have married such a dazzling and beautiful woman. However, he liked her and felt pity for her. Incidentally, he also felt pity for the 1-year-old boy. The mute lady also liked the honesty of this stranger, the muscles on his body that were full of strength, and the feeling of reliability and safety. Although she was beautiful, she was a mute widow after all, so she did not expect any good ending in life. She didn't have any relatives in Dazhou City. Those men who were always drooling over her probably only coveted her body and wanted to tie her back to be a concubine. It was even just that, her mute wife wasn't willing. She just wanted a simple and warm home. Very naturally, these two people came together. They invited a few neighbors to a meal, and Song Changgong, who came from a foreign land, stayed with the poor mute widow in Dazhou City. Then he opened a noodle shop. The 1-year-old child would sometimes come to the noodle stall, but when business was good, he could only ask the old lady in the neighborhood to take care of him. The people in Dazhou were as simple and reliable as the people around the Qin kingdom. However, the officials and bailiffs were not people. From ancient times until now, they had never been people. Thus, Gao Da's wrist that was picking noodles sank. His face was slightly lowered. Shrouded in the steam rising from the noodle pot, it was impossible to see the emotions in his eyes. The woman's face was flushed. It was a blush of embarrassment and anger. She listened to the increasingly filthy words in the shop. Tears of humiliation gradually rose in her eyes. She glanced at her husband beside noodle soup, hoping to see something. However, she didn't see anything. She was slightly disappointed and resigned to her fate. Before they got married, she knew that Brother Song was a timid person and an honest man who didn't say much more than she did. The silence of the noodle stall couple encouraged the bailiff's arrogance. Matters of the world were always like this. When one side oppressed the other, if there was no resistance, the power of the oppression would grow. One of the bailiffs stretched out his hand to grab the mute woman's small white and tender hand. She dodged it. The bailiffs became unhappy and began to curse. Gauda tightened his grip on his chopsticks. However, he knew that he had to endure it. If anything happened, he and his wife would be wanted by the imperial court. Furthermore, he was, after all, an ace of the early royal court. He always had some confidence in the Qing officials. He always thought these bailiffs were just there to enjoy themselves and would leave later. However, these bailiffs did not leave. A high-ranking official from the Ministry of Justice was holding down the fort in Dazhou. Supposedly, he was investigating a major case in secret. That was why he had chased the lower-ranking bailiffs out and forced them to walk arduously under the blazing sun. They hid in the shadow of the noodle shop and teased the beautiful but mute young lady. What a delightful thing it was. As for the man in the noodle stall, these bailiffs knew that although the man surnamed Song looked extremely sturdy, he was a piece of trash who couldn't even fart. Teasing the wife of a trash in front of his face, wouldn't that be even more delightful? The other people in the noodle shop saw that the situation was not right and had long snuck away. Before they left, they cast a sympathetic and warning gaze toward Gauda. The people did not fight with officials. They didn't want the owner of the noodle shop to actually start a fight with the bailiffs. Gauda didn't make a fuss. He just held his chopsticks and quietly called his wife back to the back of the shop. He then walked to the side of the table and awkwardly pushed up his cheeks. A smile that was uglier than crying rose to his face. He said a few words of flattery and begged for mercy. It was indeed very awkward. In this life, Gauda had only flattered Fan Xian. Fan Xian thought his flattery wasn't good enough and stopped him from learning from Wang Qinian. From that day onwards, Gouda no longer sucked up to anyone. Even a third-rank official had to be extremely courteous in front of him. To flatter and beg for mercy from these bailiffs was already the greatest concession Gouda had made for his life. He had been messing around in the world for 3 years. Logically speaking, he should have learned some things. However, he was, after all, a tiger guard Gouda with a knife in hand. He had defeated the enemy in one move in Enchanting. How could he truly break his pride and become a shrimp on the beach? Tiger guards were not guards. They were not there to serve people. They were there to kill people. The bailiffs suddenly felt that a mountain had appeared in front of them. It was the owner of the noodle shop. An imposing aura hit them in the face and made their teasing and obscenities stop abruptly. A moment later, they felt humiliated and angry because of their absent-mindedness. How could this honest person in front of them be so scared that they didn't dare to speak? It was clearly this song guy who was bent over and smiling with all his might. Because of their humiliation and anger, they became more and more arrogant. They slammed the scabbards on the table with a deafening sound. Gouda's eyes landed on their scabbards. He suddenly remembered that it had been a long time since he had touched a knife. He only held a pair of long black wooden chopsticks in his hands. He didn't make a sound and didn't resist. He allowed them to curse because he wanted to protect his wife and her child. He didn't want his wife and child to wander the world because of him. Even Gouda himself didn't want to wander the world anymore. After escaping from Dong Mountain, he could have gone to Dongyi or Northern Qi, but he didn't want to. After all, he was a Qing person. He wanted to stay in the Qing kingdom, even if the place he stayed would still have officials like tigers and wolves and the unfairness of the world. Gouda was enduring it with great difficulty. He was pretending to be weak and inexperienced. He suddenly heard a strange sound. Turning his head to look, he saw a drunk bailiff leaning against his wife's side. His hand was moving toward the round spot under the cloth skirt. Gouda's hand holding the chopsticks tightened like he was holding a very long knife. His expression didn't change. His gaze remained calm. There was no longer any restraint or pretense. He didn't need to think about anything. He just followed his instincts that he hadn't seen for 3 years and naturally swung his knife forward. Just like how he had swung at Xiao An, the assassin, and the wind, the tiger guard used a long knife. In this life, he would only use the simplest method to cut through all the problems in front of him. Perhaps Gouda had chosen the wrong path in the past 3 years. He was a saber wielder, not a subordinate. Gouda seemed to have forgotten that he was not holding a knife in his hand but a pair of chopsticks as he swung down. The bailiffs were laughing loudly as they watched. In a moment, they were going to ask their brother if the mute woman's butt was really that bouncy. Furthermore, they were going to take advantage of the chaos to go up and touch that butt a few times after the song man was knocked to the ground. With a crack, the chopsticks broke. The entire noodle stall fell silent. The mute woman stared in a daze at the scene in front of her. Her pupils gradually constricted. She appeared terrified and shocked. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her mouth gurgled. She wanted to cry out, but she couldn't make a sound. The bailiffs in the noodle stall also stopped their laughter and all their actions. They just stared dumbly in that direction. A pair of black wooden chopsticks had been cut in two. One of the chopsticks had already slit the bailiff's throat like a sharp blade. The bailiff's chest was dripping with blood. His throat had been cut open by the chopsticks, revealing his windpipe and esophagus. There were also some unknown blood vessels. The bailiff stared with a pair of dead fish pearl-like eyes at Gouda, who stood like a mountain in front of him. He slowly knelt down. Even in death, he did not understand why his throat had been cut open when he had only touched the woman's butt. He also did not understand how the pair of black chopsticks in the noodle stall owner's hands could be so sharp. Gauda's hand, which held the chopsticks, was very steady. When the bailiff died in front of him, he no longer seemed to be a noodle stall owner, but an extremely terrifying swordsman. That familiar feeling returned to his body. He walked forward and gently hugged the woman. He quietly said something by her ear and furrowed his brows slightly. He knew he had struck too hard. This bailiff's crime was not worthy of death. He had revealed his hand. Under the investigation of the Qing Kingdom's powerful state apparatus, people would probably find out about his past. However, Gauda had not struck out in anger and could not control himself. In reality, he had only lightly waved the chopsticks. He had forgotten that he was an ace at the peak of the 8th level. He had also forgotten that the people making trouble in the noodle stall were not enemies of the Juanshan Conference or the Northern Qi Brocade Guard. They were just some hateful, shameful, and pitiful bailiffs. It was just a misunderstanding, a fatal misunderstanding. Gauda had overestimated these bailiffs, so he had easily killed a person. When the other bailiffs in the noodle stall saw this, their bodies trembled. They didn't know who the owner of the noodle stall was. They were even more shocked by this bloody scene. After a long while, one of the more timid bailiffs finally screamed. "Who is it?" The scream brought everyone back to their senses. They would rather die than believe that there was someone in this world who could use a pair of chopsticks to kill someone. They thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. Perhaps the noodle stall owner had hidden some weapon earlier and caused their brother's death. One of the bailiffs secretly slipped away to report to the government. Under the lead of a small leader, the others pulled out the knives on the table and charged toward Gauda with a loud yell. Gauda lowered his head and explained something to his wife. The chopsticks in his hand had already fallen to the ground. He found that his wife was terrified. His hand reached into the wind of knives and snatched a knife. Very casually, he swung it out. There was a clanging sound, a bloody wind, and a bloody mist. The bailiffs had no power to retaliate. Their heads and bodies fell into the noodle stall. All of the bailiffs were dead. They died cleanly. Half covered in blood, Gauda held a knife in one hand and supported his wife with the other as he walked out of the noodle stall. It shocked the people on the street into an uproar. Like the tide, they parted to form a path. He knew he had to leave Dazhou as soon as possible and had to hurry. Killing these bailiffs was nothing because he was called Gauda, the leader of the Tiger Guards. He had always been a weapon for killing. His past life and history meant that he could not stay in the noodle stall forever. However, now that he had a wife and a child, he did not want to die under the pursuit of the court, so he had to escape with all his might. Under the scorching sun, Gauda and his wife embarked on the road of escape after killing people on the street. The couple did not say anything. They rushed home as soon as possible, picked up their son from the hands of the neighbor's aunt, and then picked up some money, preparing to leave the city. Along the way, the mute woman did not say a word, but her stubborn and beautiful face was full of trust and admiration for the man. She was willing to follow him. Under the scorching sun, Gauda held the child, held the knife, looked at his wife, and thought of the future wandering in Jianghu. A strong sense of apology and uneasiness welled up in his heart. He said softly, "Wife, I owe you too much." However, the government of Dazhou reacted faster than ever. Before Gauda had a chance to make up for the debt in his heart, the city gate of Dazhou had already been tightly closed. Everyone probably knows that Saling has created a web-based game, Twilight of the Gods. Many people play there. For the specific introduction of the game, everyone can go to the website to take a look. At 14:00 on November 26, the new, Dirty Universe opened. Chapter 684. Gao Da's luck was not good. It should be said to be very bad. He knew that a bailiff had secretly slipped away from the noodle stall, but he didn't care because most bailiffs were cowards who were afraid of death. Moreover, in his judgment, a mere province couldn't possibly produce any extraordinary figures. His and the mute woman's reactions could be considered quick. They returned to the courtyard, picked up the child, and headed toward the city gates. It was impossible for the government to react. When he was about half a li away from the city gates, he heard the heavy sound of the city gates closing, as well as chaotic shouts and nervous dispatches. Gao Da's eyes were wide open as he looked at the distant city gates and the increasing number of bailiffs gathering there. His heart grew cold as he felt great shock and surprise. He turned his head and glanced at the woman beside him. Her earlier movements had been too rushed. There was sweat on the woman's temples. Her face was flushed red, and her clear eyes were filled with terror and unease. Gao Da patted her hand and said in a low voice, "Don't be afraid. I'm here." The mute woman's mouth was half open as she nodded. She thought that her husband had killed a bailiff and was going against the court. Her family of 3 would probably not be able to survive. A trace of bitterness rose in her heart and seeped into her eyes. It looked very sorrowful. No one knew where the city gates had received the order, but they tightly closed the city gates and did not expand the scope of the search. Thus, it gave Gao Da some time to react. He furrowed his brows. Holding the child and the mute woman's hand, he walked toward the residential area in the back. In a moment, he disappeared into Dazhou. Gao Da's luck was very bad because a member of the Ministry of Justice's Special Division had chosen to gather in Dazhou. Coincidentally, this Special Division member had been sent by the great scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, He Zhongwei. He was investigating Tiger Guard Gao Da, who might have escaped from Dong Mountain. He Zhongwei had maintained peace in Jingdou these months because he knew that even with his power and connections in court and the emperor's favor, it was not enough to shake Fan Xian's position. Thus, he had been carrying out that matter in secret. He wanted to use Wang Qinian or Gao Da to open up this opening. However, after months of investigation, Wang Qinian of the Overwatch Council still did not have a single clue. Even though it was clear that Lao Wang was hiding with his entire family, the Special Case Department could not find any breakthrough. On the contrary, under the powerful pressure and support He Zhongwei exerted, the Ministry of Justice officials began to investigate the minute details at the foot of Dong Mountain. They faintly touched upon Gao Da's escape route. In the end, they locked onto a possible hiding spot in one of the 7 provincial counties south of Dongshan Road and north of Jiangbei Road. Dazhou was one of them. In the vast sea of people, it was extremely difficult to find an ace that everyone thought was dead. Moreover, it was impossible to issue an arrest warrant for this matter. Thus, the aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice had been searching the 7 provincial cities and the surrounding villages for the past 6 months like searching for a needle in a haystack. However, they still hadn't found him. Other than the aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice, there were also a few aces of the internal court that He Zhongwei had sent. Although the Qing Emperor had given this power to He Zhongwei to protect his personal safety, He Zhongwei had already placed all of his chips on Wang Qinian and Gao Da. Thus, he had sent all of them. Seeing that Dong Yi had been leveled and Fan Xian was about to return, Scholar He still did not hear any good news from his subordinates. Thus, he began to feel anxious. Although he maintained a calm and warm expression in front of his subordinates, in his private orders, he began to exert powerful pressure. The aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice were almost driven crazy by this pressure. They had gathered in Dazhou to exchange the information in their hands and to communicate with each other. They hoped to be able to find the Tiger Guard who had already disappeared. Coincidentally, the bailiffs they had sent into the city to check the household records were slacking off and entered a noodle shop. The owner of the noodle shop rose up and killed someone. Before the bailiffs who had slipped away could return to the dojo government, they first saw the sinister-looking and unreachable officials of the 13 yamens. In his terror, the bailiffs reported what had happened in the noodle shop to these officials from Jingdo. The officials of the Ministry of Justice, who were about to go crazy from Scholar He's pressure, felt a buzzing in their heads. Although they couldn't confirm who the owner of the noodle stall was, the criminal investigation officials' extremely sensitive intuition and powerful execution allowed them to immediately bypass the jurisdiction of the dojo government and directly give the order to close the city gates. Gaoda's family of 3 was sealed inside dojo. After a night of light, the officials of the Ministry of Justice had already confirmed the identity of the noodle shop owner. Regardless of whether it was the chopsticks broken in 2 or the wound of the bailiffs who had been decapitated, it all showed that this person had brilliant knife skills and ruthless attacks. How could an ace of this realm be hiding in a small city selling noodles? There was definitely something fishy going on. The officials of the 13 yamens were all very nervous. Torches were lit all around the noodle shop, illuminating everything inside. They thought to themselves, after working hard for more than a year, they should have finally found the right person, right? The fiery red light shone on the faces of all the officials of the Ministry of Justice. They stared nervously and excitedly at the ace of the internal court in the noodle shop, hoping to receive his final confirmation. The pale-faced ace of the internal court gently used his fingertips to press down on the broken part of the chopsticks. After a moment of silence, he nodded. The officials of the Ministry of Justice met each other's eyes. They couldn't hold back the joy in their eyes. In order to investigate this groundless court criminal, they had endured too much pressure from Scholar He. Furthermore, it was a matter without any foundation. They had run around the 7 roads of the Qin Kingdom for an entire year before finally placing their target near dojo. They had not expected their luck to be so good. Their target had jumped out on its own so quickly. The ace of the internal court was directly under He Zhongwei's command. However, he had risen and fallen in the palace these years. He didn't know why Scholar He wanted to investigate this matter. He only knew that the escaped noodle shop owner was probably the only tiger guard left in the world. A glimmer of worry flashed through his old face. He didn't know what kind of danger was hidden behind this matter. The old people in the palace all knew that the tiger guards were vicious people that Minister Fan had single-handedly trained. The Emperor had used the Dong Mountain incident to cut off all of Minister Fan's powerful wings. How could there still be one left in dojo? The eyes of the internal court ace suddenly lit up. He wondered if Scholar He had received the Emperor's secret edict, which was why he had gone through so much trouble to find this person. What about Sir Fan Jr.? If the news of this person's survival was known by Sir Fan Jr., what would the consequences be? These were things that only major figures had to consider. They were only officials and subordinates. They acted according to orders. Since it was a court criminal who had escaped before the battle, he had to be captured. The internal court ace looked at the joy in the official's eyes and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He thought to himself that these officials probably didn't know how terrifying the tiger guards were. Particularly, a tiger guard who had learned to escape before the battle. The city had been sealed for an entire day and night. The dojo Jizhou also learned of this matter. Although he was angry that some unruly commoners had dared to kill his own bailiffs, compared to such a major matter as sealing the city, he was more angry for some unknown reason. These people from the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice dared to interfere with local politics. Did they not understand that once the city was sealed, the people in dojo would have a hard time living? After the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice revealed the secret order from the Hall of Governmental Affairs and the identity of the internal court ace to the Jizhou, he immediately fell silent like a quail. He knew that the noodle stall owner was not only a court criminal but also had a terrifying background, which was why so many people from Jingdo had come to capture him. The Dajo Jijo immediately expressed his attitude. He mobilized all of the officials and bailiffs in the provincial yamen and began to cooperate with the officials from the Ministry of Justice from Jingdo to sort through the city. All of the local elders in charge were also mobilized. In a place like the Qin Kingdom, once the local government mobilized all of its power, it was not difficult to find a few people in the city. Since the criminal had a wife and child, he had to sleep, eat, and interact with people. The officials of the Ministry of Justice were very satisfied with the strength of Dajo's cooperation. They believed that in at most 2 days, they would be able to force the criminal out of the private residence in Dajo. Gouda, who had been hiding in the private residence, had not eaten for a day and night. He carefully hid his tracks and only took a risk to steal a few pieces of clothing and some food and water for the child. The tiger guards had never received training in hiding. After following Fan Xian for a few years, if Gouda truly hid by himself, it would probably be difficult for anyone to find him. Just as the government had judged, he had a wife and child by his side. This was the most troublesome matter. The mute woman's spirit had been tortured to the point where it was almost unbearable. Her large eyes were full of sorrow. Gouda knew that if the government wanted to find the 3 of them, it would take at most 2 days. After thinking for a long time, he decided to take the initiative and break out. The time to break out was chosen at dusk, the time when people most easily relaxed. This was also the first day after the noodle stand murder. In the blood-like dusk, Gouda, with a cloth chain tied to his chest and the child tied to his chest, held his wife's hand and slowly walked toward the city gate. He thought for a long time and still could not think of a way to take his family over the tall city walls, so he could only choose to force his way through. He walked step by step toward the city gate. The soldiers and bailiffs at the gate were nervously watching the people going in and out. Although the city was sealed in name, in reality, the villagers responsible for carrying water and bringing in vegetables could still enter and leave the city. However, the security here was very strict. It felt even stricter than in Jingdo. A few officials of the Ministry of Justice from Jingdo held a portrait and coldly and meticulously examined everyone's appearance. As he got closer and closer to the city gate, Gouda felt that his hands were slightly wet. It was not from his nervousness but from his wife's hands. He turned his head to glance at the mute woman and found that her body was already trembling. It looked like he would not be able to hide it from the sensitive officials of the Ministry of Justice at the city gate. Gouda sighed in his heart. Of course, he had never thought about sneaking out. The family of 3 stood in front of the city gate in front of the officials of the Ministry of Justice, bailiffs, and soldiers. They were only 27 feet away from the line that led out of the city. Outside the city gate, there was a donkey cart carrying vegetables. Gouda's eyes were fixed on the donkey cart. The city has been sealed. No one is allowed to enter or leave, a soldier said in a loud voice to Gouda. It was clear that these 3 people could not be farmers outside the city. The aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice narrowed their eyes. They looked at the family close at hand. Their pupils gradually constricted. The portrait in their hands gradually fell to the ground. Their hands slowly moved toward the hilt of their knives. It was too easy to recognize. They recognized at a glance that the newcomer was the court criminal they had been chasing for a year. They had jumped out of their own accord and come to the city gate. Did they want to kill their way out of the city gate? The aces of the Ministry of Justice slowly walked out from everywhere and gradually surrounded the family of 3. Before the encirclement had even closed in, Gouda had already raised his face and calmly glanced at the nearest ace of the Ministry of Justice. There was no emotion in his eyes, only coldness. Surrender. The ace of the Ministry of Justice suddenly felt a wave of danger coming at him. He roared loudly and pulled out the knife at his waist at the same time. Surrender. He only had time to say the first 2 words. The second two words were drowned out by a spray of blood. In a flash, Gauda took 2 quick steps forward. His hand moved like a dragon and slashed at the ace's wrist. The ace of the Ministry of Justice had no time to react. He could only quickly retreat. But just as his wrist was still swinging in the air, it broke with a crack. Gauda snatched the knife and swung down with his elbow, leaving behind a smear of blood and the collapsed body of the ace of the Ministry of Justice. He then retreated to the mute woman's side and looked coldly at the aces and soldiers of the Ministry of Justice charging at him. There was no trace of fear or self-doubt. There was only great confidence. With a knife in hand, who could stop him? The knife flashed. Gauda held the knife and charged toward the city gate with his wife and child. There was no one in front of the knife. Every time the knife came out, someone would die. He used the blood and the sound of the wind to open a path. In an instant, he was about to break through the city gate. This was victory in the word courage. In an instant, he stunned the hearts of all the officials of the Ministry of Justice. They looked at the powerful figure and found it difficult to surround him. The distance of 70 feet was not far, and the car was not far either. Gauda's body and face were already stained with a lot of blood. His hand was still tightly holding onto his mute wife, carefully protecting her. The price he paid was a few more wounds on his body. The aces of the 13 Yamans were indeed powerful, but they were not as terrifying as Gauda's bravery. Gauda roared. Like a blood dragon, he shattered the combined attack of the 3 aces in front of him. The knife shattered into countless pieces. He used these pieces to open a path and charged out of the city. At this moment, a palm pressed down in the dusk. It came from the direction of the carriage and slapped toward his face. Gauda gave a muffled grunt. He lowered his waist to the ground and threw out a punch. The fist and palm collided. Wind and smoke rose up outside the city gate. When the smoke fell, the ace from the internal court looked at him in a daze and said, "Gauda, you really didn't die." Chapter 685. After I finished writing in the afternoon, the website crashed. I couldn't update it no matter what. Then, I had an urgent matter to attend to and had to leave today, so I sent the contents of the chapter to thee and asked him to help me update it. I didn't expect to come back and find that there were no updates. I'm truly sorry. Gauda's pupils constricted slightly as he stared at the eunuch in front of him. He had carried out secret guard work for the royal family for many years. Of course, he recognized the ace of the internal court in front of him. For a moment, he wondered if Eunuch Yao had also come to Dazhou. He took a deep breath. Although he would not be afraid even if Eunuch Yao came personally, he knew that the palace had certainly found out about his whereabouts. The difficulties he was about to face must be terrifying. The eunuch coughed gently and took out a cloth from his clothes to wipe away the blood at the corners of his lips. In a raspy voice, he said, "Eunuch Yao did not come. This is a matter for the court. I am now working for Scholar He." Gauda glanced at him and cautiously took half a step back. His gaze swept around and his grip on his mute wife's hand tightened. Hearing the eunuch's words, he finally knew that there were people in court who did not believe he had died and had been investigating this matter in secret. 2 more eunuchs walked out from the shadows by the city gate. Gauda stared at the eunuch in the lead and said, "You are not a match for me." The 3 aces of the internal court were silent, particularly the one in front. His emotions were unusually complicated. This time, they had followed the aces of the Ministry of Justice's 13 Yamans to Dazhou to do business. They faintly knew that Scholar He was investigating the omissions from the Dong Mountain incident 3 years ago. This eunuch had not thought that he would actually find Gauda, this tiger guard. The officials of the Ministry of Justice had already surrounded them. Other than those who had been injured by Gauda's knife, there were dozens of people. Looking at the situation, even if Gauda grew wings, he would not be able to fly out. The eunuch coughed again. When he had exchanged blows with Gauda earlier, his internal strength had rebounded and he had already been injured. The gaze he looked at Gauda with fear and admiration. I didn't expect you to actually be alive. I also didn't expect you to not fall behind all these years. The eunuch's gaze was a bit muddy but carried a ruthless coldness. Since I was lucky to run into you today, don't think about leaving. As if his face had changed, the eunuch's expression suddenly became cold and grim. Gauda had long gotten used to the way the internal court did things. He only looked at him calmly and said, "If you want to keep me here, you will probably have to pay a great price. We are not afraid of paying the price." The eunuch glanced at the beautiful woman beside him and said with a strange smile, "However, the price you will pay may not be something you can bear. Just surrender. You know you have no way out, so why drag others down?" The eunuch said gently. At this moment, the sun had already set, leaving behind a wisp of helpless twilight that enveloped the city gate. It was drowsy and caused one to feel drowsy. A hint of struggle and sorrow flashed through Gauda's eyes. After a moment of silence, he faintly said, "If I'm captured by you, I won't be able to live." "Does that mean she will be able to live?" The eunuch lowered his head and said a moment later, "Adults naturally have to pay for their actions. As for whether the child on your chest is dead or alive, only the palace can decide." "Then why shouldn't I? You don't have to die right now. You can live a few more days. As for this child, perhaps after that young man learns of this matter, he will be willing to protect it for you." The eunuch glanced at him meaningfully. "Young man." A glimmer of confusion flashed through Gauda's eyes. If Sir Fan Jr. knew he was still alive in this world, was surrounded by people outside the Dajo city gate, and knew he had a child in his arms, what would he do? He had committed the crime of deceiving the ruler, so there was no reason for him to escape. However, Sir Fan Jr. should be able to protect the child in his arms, right? The officials of the Ministry of Justice all maintained their silence. The gaze they looked at the knife-wielding man carried a glimmer of fear. In the battle at the city gate earlier, in just a few breaths, 6 of their colleagues had died tragically to that blade light. They knew this knife-wielding man with his wife and child was the legendary Tiger Guard, the Tiger Guard who had fought Sigurd Jian to the death on Dong Mountain. They had already surrounded him, so why didn't they immediately charge forward and cut him to pieces? Everyone had this impulse because of the unease in their hearts. However, they knew that Scholar He's secret investigation this time would ultimately rely on these 3 internal court aces. The other party had not spoken to attack, so it was best for them to remain silent. Perhaps it was because he saw Gauda struggling and hesitating that the expression of the internal court ace gradually darkened. In a stern voice, he said, "You were a Tiger Guard of the royal family. You fled on Dong Mountain and abandoned the ruler. This is seen as treason. If you still don't kneel, do you want to continue rebelling?" Gauda's face became deathly pale. Sigurd Jian's sword had attacked from the sky on Dong Mountain. The limbs of his comrades below the long stone steps had been sent flying. Fresh blood flowed between the mountain rocks. These scenes reappeared in front of his eyes. He was the commander of the Tiger Guards and a well-known figure among the hundreds of Tiger Guards. Ever since he was young, he had been instilled with the idea of loyalty to the ruler and patriotism. He was willing to die for the emperor. However, Gauda had followed Fan Xian for 3 whole years. His horizons had gradually widened. Most importantly, his personality and outlook on life had been greatly influenced by Fan Xian. Fan Xian had always been a gentle person. The small details of his daily life and the taste in his words were enough to affect too many people by his side. Thus, Gauda was the first tiger guard in history to flee on the eve of battle. The ace of the internal court had brought up the Dong Mountain incident to weaken his fighting spirit. The deathly pale color on Gauda's face did not remain for long. It gradually returned to normal. He stared at the other party with a chill and said, "Abandon the ruler. Abandon the ruler." When he had made up his mind to flee Dong Mountain, Gauda had struggled in his heart. However, during these 3 years of wandering among the Qing people, his thoughts in his dreams at night, and the rumors he had heard, they had made him think about the events of the past countless times. His voice became sharp and cold like a knife. He angrily said, "Was it me who abandoned the emperor, or was it the emperor who abandoned me?" On Dong Mountain, 100 tiger guards all died at the hands of the enemy for the sake of exhausting Siga Jian's killing intent. Gauda grew angry. His voice grew louder as his eyes widened in anger. "I am a tiger guard. I am willing to use my life to protect the emperor's safety, but I am not willing to throw my life away for some bullshit*t reason. Even if I die, I want to die knowing the reason." Gauda's hand slowly tightened around the hilt of his knife and pulled the mute woman behind him. Glaring at the ace of the internal court, he enunciated each word clearly, "I just don't want to die like those companions of mine who are useless and muddle-headed." "What is wrong with that?" The ace's voice grew sharp and trembled. It was as if he had not expected to hear this tiger guard say such treasonous words outside Dazhou's city gates. He cursed angrily in a sharp voice, "If the emperor wants the official to die, the official has no choice but to die. As a tiger guard, how could you say such treasonous words? You are truly incorrigible. I've already done treasonous things. What's there to say?" At this moment, Gauda suddenly felt his entire body relax. He had finally vented all of his resentment toward the emperor. Yes, the tiger guards were only death fighters raised by the royal family, but Gauda was already an independent person. He did not want to live muddle-headed and die muddle-headed. Gauda used strips of cloth to tightly tie the mute woman to his back. His hands forcefully tightened the lines. As he did this, no one at the city gates moved. They all waited nervously for the ace of the internal court to speak. "If you continue to defy the edict, don't you think that Sir Fan Jr. will be dragged down by you?" The ace's hands slowly trembled. He was gathering his energy. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and said something that pierced straight into Gauda's heart. Gauda laughed coldly and said, "Who is Fan Xian? If he's dragged down, then he's dragged down. Is there anyone good in this world?" The ace's expression changed slightly. It was as if he had not expected Gauda to say such a thing. Did he not have any affection for Sir Fan Jr. anymore? Of course, the truth of the matter was not like this. When the ace said that he was not under Eunuch Yao's orders to capture him, Gauda knew that there was something fishy about this matter. After hearing Scholar He's name, Gauda immediately knew what he wanted to do. More accurately, he knew what he wanted to do. Regardless of whether it was in court or among the Qing people, everyone knew that in the Qing court, Sir Fan Jr. had been suppressing Scholar He with all his strength. Scholar He, relying on his royal favor, was also fighting desperately against Sir Fan Jr. The two sides were like fire and water. However, under the emperor's suppression, there was no chance for them to explode. Gauda knew that given Sir Fan Jr.'s ability and strength, it was impossible for He Zongwei to find a way to defeat him. There did not seem to be a single hole in Sir Fan Jr.'s body. Unexpectedly, he, who had escaped from Dong Mountain and survived, was, without question, a hole in Fan Xian's plan. He Zongwei only wanted to capture Gauda or Wang Qinian. He didn't want these two people to die. As long as he captured Gauda, it would be like he had captured one of Fan Xian's tails, even though Fan Xian didn't know he had a tail. Gauda lifted his wife's body up. The murderous intent in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. He stared at the ace and didn't say a word. If he was captured alive by the court and used by his own way to defeat Sir Fan Jr., what kind of harm would that cause? Gauda had followed Fan Xian for too long and understood him well. Sir Fan Jr. appeared cold and heartless, but he was actually a very protective person. This kind of protection was different from Director Chen's. Fan Xian would give his truest concern to the people close to him. If the court captured him, Sir Fan Jr. would probably risk a taboo to rescue him. Gauda did not want Sir Fan Jr. to sink into a dangerous situation for him, so he decided to fight to the death and not surrender. He would rather die in front of Dazhou's city gates than surrender without a fight. He also did not want to drag him down for a few more days. However, he had wronged the wife behind him and the child in front of him. A glimmer of hopelessness flashed through Gauda's eyes, as well as a deep sense of guilt. Holding the knife in his hand, he roared and charged forward. There was no end to killing people. There would always be a moment when a knife would break. How could one person oppose the powerful machinery of a country? Although Gauda was valiant, he was not a great grandmaster. Under the powerful pursuit of the Qin court, it was already particularly terrifying that he could last until nightfall. Soaked in blood and exhausted, he only managed to charge 3 li out of Dazhou. The Ministry of Justice aces and soldiers who had surrounded him cleverly maintained their distance and only attacked in batches. They did not allow the situation to become so chaotic that Gauda had any chance to break out of the encirclement. There were torches all around, scattered all around the road. They looked brighter than the stars in the sky. The ace looked coldly at the pursuit on the road in front of him, judging when Gauda would run out of energy. He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "Have the children be careful. Don't just attack the woman on his back." An official of the Ministry of Justice was slightly shocked. Turning his head to glance at him, he asked, "Sir, why is that?" In the eyes of these officials, although Tiger Guard Gauda was more powerful than they had imagined, he had a child in his arms and a woman on his back. As long as the tip of the knife pointed toward those places, he would always have some fear and be injured more. The ace slowly walked toward the center of the battle. As he walked, he coughed. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "If we really accidentally kill that woman, once Gauda goes crazy, how can we capture him alive? As long as that woman is alive, she is as heavy as a mountain for Gauda. Even if he wants to commit suicide, he will have to think about it a bit longer." Even now, this ace still wanted to capture Gauda alive. After all, this was something Scholar he had requested countless times. If Gauda died, how could he threaten Fan Xian? His own way was still hoping to use Gauda to provoke the relationship between Fan Xian and the Emperor. This ace could not guess. No one knew how many people Gauda had killed. He was like a mad tiger and covered in blood. 2 of the 3 internal court aces had already been heavily injured by his heavy blows. Many officials of the Ministry of Justice had also died to his knife. However, his knife was gradually cracking. The Jinqi in his body was about to be exhausted. Everyone could see that after the court had paid the price of dozens of lives, this vicious imperial criminal was finally about to collapse. Everyone let out a breath in their hearts. The Ministry of Justice's special anesthetic began to be applied to the blade of the knife, preparing to carry out the final work of closing the net. A row of black carriages came from the other end of the road. This group of carriages was very strange. It was serene and dark, like people had come from the underworld. The group of carriages was very long and seemed to have no end in sight. Gauda chopped off the right arm of an ace from the 13 yamans to his right. Suddenly, he felt his left knee soften. He knew that he was at the end of his rope. With an unwilling howl, he charged toward the group of carriages. The pursuing officials were not nervous. They were also not worried about whether or not the group of carriages would be caught in the crossfire. They continued to move forward at a leisurely pace. In the black carriages, the Overwatch Council official was talking to the old man inside the curtain. He saw the city full of lights and a bloody man. His gaze became complicated. It was not until the bloody man ran close that the Overwatch Council official saw clearly that there were actually 3 people in this bloody man. The Overwatch Council official floated over and caught the bloody man the moment he fell to the ground. His brows twitched. In a raspy voice, he suppressed his excitement and said, "Gouda, you've gotten a wife." The knife in Gouda's hand was stuck into the ground. He was about to take this person hostage when he suddenly heard this joke. Raising his head, he saw a stranger. Chapter 686. The black group of carriages was surrounded by twinkling torches that lit up the road. However, the group was too long. Even though the Dajo Yamen had come out in full force, the aces from the 13 Yamens led by the 3 internal court eunuchs could only cut off half of the group of carriages. They had no way of surrounding the entire group. However, these officials' eyes were fixed on the court criminal. They were not worried that this bloody man with his wife and child would disappear from their sight. However, no one dared to rush forward and grab the Gundam. This was because everyone sensed something strange. The person carrying the criminal was clearly not an ordinary person. The official robes he wore were somewhat familiar to everyone. Most importantly, this long group of black carriages. Although the style of the carriages looked normal, a group of over 30 carriages was not a sight that could be seen at any time. Even the stupidest person could guess that there were important figures in the group. The officials of the 13 offices of the Ministry of Justice secretly spat and cursed their bad luck. They had never thought that they would run into such a strange group of carriages outside the remote Dajo city. They had just been extremely lucky and had finally captured a criminal of the imperial court that the court had been secretly searching for a long time. The officials of the Ministry of Justice did not panic. Although they temporarily did not know the identity of this group of carriages, they were acting on the orders of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. They could be considered half an imperial mission. Who in the world dared to stop them? Even if the people in this group of black carriages were nobles in the court, they could not criticize the court's actions in capturing a criminal. 3 internal court eunuchs walked out of the crowd surrounded by torches. The old eunuch at the front narrowed his eyes and looked at the strange group of carriages. He looked at the court criminal covered in blood lying on the flat ground in front of the carriage. A few people in black official robes seemed to be treating him. The mute woman with a deathly pale face was holding her child and looking nervously at the criminal. The internal court ace's eyes narrowed. His nose twitched slightly. He felt a glimmer of surprise and unease. He had easily recognized the people in black official robes in the carriages and which side they belonged to. During the battle, although Gouda had bravely charged onto the road and heavily injured 2 internal court aces, he himself was at the end of his strength. He had to protect the wife on his back and the child in his arms. There were many wounds on his body that should not have appeared. The internal court ace who was in charge of the arrest also felt his chi and blood churn. He could not calm down for a moment. He looked at the convoy in front of him and frowned slightly. Of course, he wouldn't be too arrogant. He was just a little afraid. As an internal court ace with orders from the emperor, even if this group of carriages truly belonged to the Overwatch Council, he had nothing to be afraid of. The problem was, he didn't know the rank of this group of carriages in the Overwatch Council. Most importantly, the criminal the court wanted was Tiger Guard Gouda, who had once been Sir Fan Jr.'s trusted bodyguard. If the Overwatch Council discovered this and Sir Fan Jr. was in this group of carriages, the eunuch took a deep breath and slowly walked forward under the light of the torch. Facing the pure black carriage on the road, he said in a raspy voice, "Internal Court Hichigan has come by imperial edict to capture a criminal." He didn't first ask about the identity of this group of carriages. Instead, he took the initiative to state his identity and purpose of coming. Thus, if the black group of carriages made any strange movements, the internal court would have a head start. The aces of the 13 yamans of the Ministry of Justice gradually realized that something was wrong. They were no longer as confident as before. Instead, they spread out warily around the carriage. However, the soldiers of the Dajo Yamen were confused. These men from Jingdo all had their eyes on top of their heads. Even when faced with the court criminal who was like a vicious tiger, no one would take a step back. Why were they so cautious when faced with this black group of carriages? Criminal. The Overwatch Council official squatting by Gao Da's side and tending to his injuries suddenly furrowed his brows. Hearing the internal court eunuch's words, a complicated emotion suddenly flashed through his eyes. Gazing at the unconscious Gao Da, he muttered to himself in a low voice, "So, you also slipped away back then." The internal court eunuch did not receive a reply, but this was within his expectations. The Overwatch Council's actions had always been secretive. Once they went up against the major yamans of the court, they became unusually arrogant and unreasonable. Although the internal court had the function of supervising the Overwatch Council in name, with the deliberate connivance of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian, the previous two directors, the Overwatch Council was not very afraid of the internal court. Which official of the council is in the group of carriages? Is there something important? The internal court eunuch's eyelids drooped slightly. Coldly, he said, "Please hand this criminal to the internal court to deal with." There were more than 30 carriages. No one knew how many officials, secret agents, or important items they carried. For the Overwatch Council to pull out more than 30 specially made carriages, if they were not protecting a particularly important person in the council, then they were responsible for a very important mission. Although this eunuch was an ace of the internal court, he did not want to affect the Overwatch Council's affairs. He was particularly afraid that his luck would be so bad that he would run into Sir Fan Jr. outside Dajo. The Overwatch Council official crouching by Gao Da's side slowly rose. Facing the blinding light of the torch, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the internal court ace. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "I am the deputy head of the second bureau of the Overwatch Council. Please show me your edict." The internal court eunuch's temple suddenly throbbed with a burning sensation. He had not thought that after he and his group had revealed their identities, this Overwatch Council official would still want to see the edict he carried with him. The Overwatch Council was not afraid of the internal court, and the internal court was even less afraid of the Overwatch Council. They were only afraid of the two directors of the Overwatch Council. In front of the Emperor, these two directors carried more weight than the entire internal court combined. Thus, in their daily interactions, the internal court was polite to the Overwatch Council, and the Overwatch Council did not want to offend the internal court. For this Overwatch Council official to say such a thing in a situation like this, it appeared incomparably tyrannical. Involuntarily, it made the internal court eunuch's heart tremble. This was very different from the Overwatch Council's usual style. Was there really a Sir Fan Jr. in the carriages? Please allow me to come forward and pay my respects. The internal court eunuch gritted his teeth. Although the Overwatch Council was powerful, he was not afraid. He was only afraid that Sir Fan Jr. was truly in the carriages. Otherwise, why would this official be so cold and stubborn? The director is currently working in Dongyi. The Overwatch Council official furrowed his brows and glanced at him. It was as if he had not expected the other party to start probing so quickly. Coldly, he said, "Since we are all working for the court, is there a problem with me wanting to see your seal?" Hearing that Fan Xian was not in the carriages, the internal court eunuch's heart immediately calmed. Although the Overwatch Council was terrifying, it was, after all, the Emperor's special forces. They did not have the courage to stop the internal court from doing things. When does the internal court need to report to the Overwatch Council for internal court matters? The internal court eunuch's face gradually darkened. In a raspy voice, he said, "Someone, take this court criminal into custody." After giving this order, his eyes moved to the face of the deputy head of the Second Bureau. His gaze seemed to be tangible as he tried to intimidate him. At this moment, the internal court was working with the 13 yamens. If the Overwatch Council insisted on forcefully interfering, what was the difference between that and rebellion? During this year, he had been sent by the Emperor to serve under Scholar He and endlessly pursued Gouda through the mountains and fields of the Qin Kingdom. He had never returned to Jingdo, so he did not know much about the Overwatch Council. He only knew that Sir Fan Jr. had indeed been busy with the matter of Dongyi submitting. He didn't know who this black carriage might be carrying. The aces of the Ministry of Justice's 13 yamens met each other's eyes. They all saw the wariness and unease in each other's eyes. They knew that everyone in the carriage was an official of the Overwatch Council. The officials of the 6 ministries and 3 temples all had an innate fear and resistance toward the Overwatch Council. Normally, these officials of the Ministry of Justice would not, no matter what, directly oppose the Overwatch Council. However, they were working for the court. Furthermore, countless eyes were looking at the blood-soaked criminal lying among the Overwatch Council officials. They were much more confident than before. The officials of the Ministry of Justice slowly and steadily moved toward the side of the carriage. The Overwatch Council officials beside the carriage did not make any movements. It was as if they also felt that they shouldn't fall out with the entire internal court and the Ministry of Justice for a court criminal. The people surrounding them all let out a breath at the same time. They watched as a few officials of the Ministry of Justice had already walked to Tiger Guard Gao Da's side. They took out the shackles and were preparing to put on the shackles. The Overwatch Council official, who had been silent and furrowed his brows the entire time, suddenly opened his mouth and said, "That's still not right. If you say he's a court criminal, then he's a court criminal. You're a eunuch of the internal court, not an official of the Supreme Court." Immediately after, he waved his hand. A number of cold lights flashed. The Overwatch Council officials around Gouda still had their hands behind their backs and did not move. From the darkness around the carriage, a few swordsmen swept out like a gust of wind. In a flash, they drew their swords and placed them across the necks of the officials of the Ministry of Justice. The faces of the officials of the Ministry of Justice immediately paled. They had been careful the entire time. They had not expected that such powerful aces were hidden in the seemingly distant darkness around the road illuminated by the torches. Before they could even make a move, they had been subdued by the other party. The internal court ace slowly raised his head and narrowed his eyes. His pupils constricted slightly as he looked at the movement in front of him. He looked at the swordsman completely shrouded in black clothing and couldn't help but feel a glimmer of coldness. The assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council truly lived up to their reputation. However, he was not afraid at all. Looking at the deputy head of the 2nd Bureau, he coldly said, "It looks like you also know the identity of this criminal and that he was Director Fan's trusted aide. What was killing people?" This was killing people. The hundreds of people present all heard these words. No one could kill everyone to silence them. As long as the Overwatch Council stopped the internal court from capturing this criminal, then the rumors added to Fan Xian's name would naturally travel to Jingdo. The Overwatch Council official lowered his head slightly and thought for a moment. He then said, "Stupid old eunuch, I don't care what you say. You said you were acting by imperial edict, so I want to see your seal. Even if you don't have it, you still have to show me the Ministry of Justice's wanted notice." Otherwise, if I say you are a bandit who has brought disaster to your village, what excuse do you have? After saying this, a cold smile rose to the corners of the official's lips. He appeared icy and confident. Standing behind everyone, the Dajo Jijo was the highest-ranking official. However, he knew that there was something fishy about this matter. Furthermore, it involved the Overwatch Council, the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the Internal Court, and the Ministry of Justice. As a mere Jijo of a small province, how could he involve himself in this? Hearing about the bandit, the Jijo couldn't help but smile bitterly. The people of the Overwatch Council were indeed shameless and ruthless. In front of so many court officials, they dared to call an internal court eunuch a bandit. Capturing Gouda and Wang Qinian had always been a secret matter that He Zhongwei had secretly carried out. He wanted to hide this matter until the end so that once the conflict between the emperor and Fan Xian exploded, there would be no chance to turn it around. Thus, he had not reported it to the emperor ahead of time. Of course, it was impossible for him to have the emperor's personal seal. Furthermore, he did not dare to let Fan Xian's powerful subordinates know of his plans. Thus, everything was done in secret. There wasn't even a Ministry of Justice wanted notice. If he captured Gouda or Wang Qinian, it would be easy to make up for these procedures later. However, the Overwatch Council official had sharp eyes and immediately saw the problem. With one sentence, he forced the Internal Court and the Ministry of Justice's special department officials to the foot of the mountain. The Internal Court eunuch was silent for a moment. He could not bring out the Emperor's edict or the Ministry of Justice's wanted notice, but he could not just watch as Gouda, a court criminal, slipped away in front of his eyes. My identity is naturally verified by the officials of the Ministry of Justice. All the officials of the Ministry of Justice have tokens with them. The Internal Court eunuch coldly turned the matter in another direction. If the Overwatch Council wants to stop us, they might as well kill us all. After these words were said, the entire road fell silent. A stern and cold atmosphere began to spread among the crowd. They appeared nervous, but the Internal Court eunuch's heart was calm. Presumably, the officials in the Overwatch Council carriages had already learned of Tiger Guard Gao Da's identity in the shortest amount of time possible. They knew of Gao Da's relationship with their director. Regardless of whether or not they had found out what the court wanted to do with this matter, they would not allow the Internal Court to capture Gouda so easily. The problem was, the Internal Court and Ministry of Justice had to capture Gouda and bring him back to Jingdo before the Overwatch Council sent the information to Fan Xian. They had to use force. The Internal Court eunuch believed that no matter how forceful the Overwatch Council was, they would not kill everyone in the mountains of the Qin Kingdom. The eunuch believed that the 30-odd carriages of the Overwatch Council had the power to kill all of them. He believed that if the Overwatch Council did not want to rebel, they would not use such ruthless methods. Thus, he walked coldly and slowly toward Gouda. The Overwatch Council official turned his body and looked at him coldly out of the corner of his eye. It was as if he was still calculating how to handle the situation before him. If this had been any other time, the official would have long thought of countless sinister ideas that would make the Internal Court and Ministry of Justice want to eat sh*t. However, he had suddenly encountered Gouda and suddenly heard that the court was capturing an imperial criminal. In particular, he had discovered the hidden dangers of this matter that could drag the commissioner into it. The official's emotions were agitated. For a moment, he could not come up with a firm idea. No one came down from the carriage. All of the Overwatch Council officials and secret agents, including the 6th Bureau swordsman hidden in the darkness, waited for him to speak. He still did not speak until the Internal Court eunuch walked to Gao Da's side. Right at this moment, a wave of noise suddenly broke the silence and austere atmosphere outside Dazhou City. A wave of women's laughter and noise suddenly resounded through the night sky. It was just like the stories of fox immortals told in novels. The silent long night suddenly became a paradise for people to take a stroll in. Everyone's ears perked up. They grew nervous. How could there suddenly be so many women in the middle of the night? Immediately after, these people's eyes widened. They had never thought that one day, no, one night, they would see so many beautiful women at the same time. Countless beautiful women in colorful dresses, beautiful as the wind, elegant figures, and all kinds of makeup surged from the back of the carriages toward the sternly scene. They seemed to not know that there was a tense atmosphere in front of them. They continued to excitedly talk about the frustrations of the journey and whose rouge was stained with dust. The road back home seemed to be quite far. After sitting in the carriage for so long, he felt a bit of a need to use the toilet. He wanted to squat in the grass, but none of the wild men in the yard were as tactful as Sir Fan Jr. They didn't even say anything about stopping. With great difficulty, the group of carriages stopped, but no one came to help their hands. This carriage was quite skilled. Everyone looked at this scene dumbfounded. They all felt they had sunk into an unreal environment, particularly the officials of the Ministry of Justice at the very front. Looking at this scene, it was like they had seen a ghost. The old internal court eunuch, who had walked calmly to Gao Da's side, suddenly opened his eyes wide. He abruptly stood up and looked at these beautiful women. He suddenly thought of the garden everyone in Jingdo knew about. Then, he saw a pure black wheelchair being carried down from the pure black carriage. An old cripple sat in the wheelchair. His knees were covered with a wool blanket. The old cripple looked at the head eunuch and said in a raspy and slightly sharp voice, "Why have you stopped for so long? It looks like if I don't become the director, my words won't be as effective as that kid's." The internal court ace looked at Chen Pingping like he was looking at a ghost. He could not understand why this old man would suddenly appear outside Dazhou. His knees unconsciously began to tremble. His entire body and mind were taken over by a kind of terror. He knew he had made a huge mistake. He had only thought that if Sir Fan Jr. was not in the carriages, no one in the Overwatch Council would dare to directly challenge the authority the internal court represented. He had not thought that while Sir Fan Jr. was not there, the old director was in the carriages. With a thud, he knelt down and lowered his head deeply. Respectfully, he said, "Greetings, Director." All of the dumbfounded officials, bailiffs, and soldiers immediately guessed the old cripple's identity. The Qing Kingdom's decades of sinister power pressed down on them until they didn't dare to move. They knelt straight to the ground, including the Dazhou Jizhou. There was no exception. On both sides of the road, officials knelt on the ground toward the old cripple beside the carriage. Chen Pingping looked around with a calm expression. Suddenly, he clenched his fist and gently coughed. A strange emotion flashed through his eyes. He muttered to himself, "Yi Zi was right. Qiao Qiao's mother indeed gave birth to Qiao Qiao." 4 days ago, the entire royal palace in Jingdo was enveloped in the faint sunlight of the end of summer and beginning of autumn. It was clear and peaceful. The Qing kingdom was in the midst of a joyous occasion. From the emperor to the peddlers and servants, their bodies all emanated a fresh and enchanting aura from the inside out. The usually sinister royal palace seemed to have changed. The slowly moving spots of light in Taiji Palace all appeared mischievous. The only place that had not changed was the royal study. There was a heating stove in the winter and a basin of ice in the summer. It was like spring all year round. The lack of change was annoying. The master of the royal study, the Qing kingdom's great emperor, was a terrifying figure who had remained the same for decades and had not changed at all. The people of the Ministry of Justice should have arrived in Dazhou. Find time to deal with this matter. The emperor coldly put down his teacup. The great prince had already arrived in Dongyi and had begun to deal with the rebellion in the Liang kingdom. The secret memorials had just been sent back to Jingdo. The emperor only glanced at them briefly and then stopped caring about them. It should not be difficult for his two sons to deal with the small matters in Dongyi. Scholar, he has put in a lot of effort. Eunuch Yao looked at his nose and his nose at his heart. He said this very normally. Although his words were normal, the reality was not normal. Although He Zhongwei had always wanted to have a good relationship with the heads of the eunuchs in the palace and had invested a great deal of passion and money into it, for some reason, the respect and affection the eunuchs and serving girls had for Fan Xian came from the bottom of their hearts and had never changed. Eunuch Yao's words were, without a doubt, a hidden stab at Scholar He. The Qing emperor's expression did not change. He only laughed slightly and said, He Zhongwei is also afraid of death. However, that person called Gouda has already lived for so long. I have given Nji enough face, although he does not seem to know that the traitor is still alive. Eunuch Yao suddenly said in a trembling voice, the old director will pass by Dazhou in 3 days. Your Majesty, please make a decision. Chapter 687. The mischievous speck of light ran away coolly from under the bright tiles of Taiji Palace. Passing through the heavy wooden doors of the rear palace, it ran into Hongguang Palace, burrowed into Shufang Palace, circled a few times under the slightly scarred tree, and finally hid in Guangxin Palace, which no one had lived in for a long time. Even in the slightly dry autumn wind, Guangxin Palace continued to emit a faint and bitter coldness. The white curtains in the palace had long become broken and brittle muslin. There were plum blossoms but no people. They only shone brilliantly. Even when they bloomed to the point of decay, they were still lonely. Compared to the quiet back palace, the imperial city around the front hall did not match the light atmosphere of the imperial palace. Especially inside the green stone imperial city, in the room deep under the vermilion-red palace wall, there was a solemn atmosphere. A few cold-eyed generals stood guard outside the room, but inside the room, it was unknown what they were talking about. I wonder when the great prince will return. General Gong Dian, who had resumed his position as commander of the imperial army and was in charge of the safety of the entire royal palace, stood by the person's side. There were not many people in this world who could make Gong Dian stand so obediently by his side. The person at the table was one of them. The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, who had rendered meritorious service during the Jingdo Rebellion and was now appointed by the emperor to control the armies of the world, Commander Yi stroked his teacup with one hand. His eyes appeared slightly serious. He didn't speak for a long time. Brother. Perhaps this kind of silence was difficult for Gong Dian to endure. In the end, he couldn't resist reminding him. Oh. Yi Zhong seemed to wake from his thoughts and replied, Director Fan Jr. will be returning to the capital in a few days. If the great prince wants to return, it will be at least the beginning of spring. He glanced at Gong Dian. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. A moment later, he said in a low voice, What exactly do you want to ask? Even if the great prince returns to the capital, presumably he will immediately be transferred to Yanjing by the emperor to prepare for the northern expedition. What exactly do you want to ask? Gong Dian was silent. He and Yi Zhong were both the emperor's trusted aides. However, although the entire royal palace appeared peaceful this afternoon, there was a murderous intent hidden within it that he was not used to. He faintly guessed that this murderous intent had something to do with the major figure who had just left Jingdo not long ago. Otherwise, his senior brother would not have been overseeing matters in the Bureau of Military Affairs. Instead, he calmly waited outside the royal palace for an entire day. What are you waiting for? Asked Gong Dian. I'm waiting for His Majesty's decree. After Yi Zhong said this, he remembered that the emperor was currently making a decision. A trace of anxiety and uneasiness appeared in his eyes. With Yi Chang's status and power, there were few things in the world that could make him feel this way. He closed his eyes slowly, not wanting Gong Dian to see this. However, Gong Dian had already seen it and knew that he had guessed correctly. Inside and outside the royal palace, it appeared peaceful. In reality, undercurrents were surging. The defense level of the entire imperial army had been raised to its most tense state. Gong Dian had only accepted orders from the internal court. He didn't know what the emperor deep in the palace was guarding against. Immediately after, the imperial army received a seal from the Jingdo garrison. Only then did they know that Shi Fei had led 15,000 Jingdo garrison soldiers and spread out in a formation along the south side of Jingdo. It seemed to be a drill, but it also seemed like they were preparing for a major battle. The Bureau of Military Affairs also moved. The internal court also moved. In the streets and alleys of Jingdo, various factions began to prepare. To be able to move so much military power and arrange such a large formation within one day, it could only be the Qing Emperor alone. In the present world, there was only one person who was worthy of the Emperor's serious and careful treatment and who had the power to make the Emperor expend so much energy. Only that person could make Yi Zhong, the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, unable to stop his uneasiness and anxiety as he waited for the Emperor's final decree. All sorts of situations interweaved together. Gong Dian finally confirmed that the Emperor was going to act against Director Qin. Why? Gong Dian's throat was a bit dry. He sat down by Yi Zhong's side and raised his cup of cold tea to drink it in one gulp. However, it did not extinguish the burning fear in his heart. The imperial army protecting the palace, the movement of the garrison, and the Bureau of Military Affairs were, without question, arrangements aimed at the Overwatch Council in Jingdo. Regardless of whether it was the Emperor, Commander Yi Zhong, or Gong Dian, once they thought that the person they were going to deal with was Chen Pingping, none of them had complete confidence. Only these people at the very top of the Qing kingdom knew what kind of power Chen Pingping, this skinny old cripple, had in his hands. Although he was no longer the director of the Overwatch Council, he had been the king in the darkness of the land for decades. Once he was in a dangerous situation, who knew what kind of power he would explode with? What made Gong Dian feel the most terrified, uneasy, and even faintly angry at the emperor was that he could not find any reason why the court wanted to deal with Director Qin. Was it just because his achievements shocked the emperor? This made no sense at all. If he had considered this, perhaps the emperor would have killed Chen Pingping 20 years ago. Did Chen Pingping have disloyalty? Everyone under heaven knew that Director Qin was the most loyal official at the emperor's side. If it weren't for him, the emperor would have died countless times back then. Why? This was the explanation Gong Dian needed to hear the most. He began to feel that the emperor was too muddle-headed. Regardless of what the people thought of the Overwatch Council or Chen Pingping, the Overwatch Council was the emperor's special agency. Chen Pingping had always been the emperor's loyal dog. For the emperor to risk the danger of court chaos to do such an unreasonable thing, if it wasn't muddle-headed, what was it? Yi Zhong sat by the little table and was silent for a long time without saying a word. Of course, he knew why Gong Dian had lost his composure. Even though he had countless soldiers in his hands, he knew that he was dealing with Chen Pingping and the entire Overwatch Council. In the depths of his heart, he still felt a tremor and fear. Chen Pingping's reputation was too great. The things in his head were not things that normal officials could understand. Decades of history had long proven that anyone who used crafty plots and schemes to deal with Chen Pingping, in the end, would not meet a good end. Xiao An at his peak was one of them. The rebellions of the eldest princess and the old Qin family became a joke under the combined efforts of Director Qin and the emperor. Yi Zhong took a deep breath. There was a hint of unswerving determination in the darkness of his square face. What you need to do is to protect the safety of the royal palace. What I need to do, without question, is to stabilize the Qin Kingdom's army. As for those other things, naturally, someone will do it. You must act. Otherwise, the emperor would not have summoned you here today. Gong Dian glanced at his brother disciple with a face full of worry. He didn't feel good in his heart. Back then, Chen Pingping had been able to place a 20-year spy in the old Qin family. Who knew who in the Yi family or even the most reliable Dingzhou army were Chen Pingping's people? The emperor is muddle-headed. Gong Dian thought that if the emperor truly broke off relations with Director Qin, no matter what the final outcome was, the entire Qin court would suffer irreversible damage because of this turmoil. The Overwatch Council might not rebel. Yi Zhong closed his eyes tightly and faintly said, the emperor must have his own way of controlling the Overwatch Council. Gong Dian only shook his head. Although in his heart, the emperor was the most powerful person in the world and most worthy of loyalty and worship, Chen Pingping was, without question, the most powerful person hidden in the darkness. The Overwatch Council was not so easy to control. Immediately after, he thought of another terrifying matter. If the old director is truly captured and brought back to Jingdou, Gong Dian stared into Yi Zhong's eyes and said through gritted teeth, what will Sir Fan Jr. do? The emperor is muddle-headed. This was the third time he had said the emperor was muddle-headed. As a loyal official, Gong Dian's reaction was indeed a bit big. However, this could not be blamed on him. Anyone who knew the true movements of the court would feel a chill from the bottom of their hearts. If this operation was targeted at Chen Pingping, it was the same as targeting the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian. Yi Zhong suddenly opened his eyes and coldly said, he has probably just left Dongyi. Once the ship has sailed, what can he change? Even if Chen Pingping has the grace of passing on his legacy to him, in the end, this is the emperor's will. As a son, would Fan Xian have the desire to avenge his father because of an old superior? Gong Dian thought about it carefully and slowly nodded his head. These two important military officials only thought that Fan Xian being able to take control of the Overwatch Council was the emperor's will and that Chen Pingping had only played the role of passing on help and guidance. They had completely not thought of Fan Xian's feelings for Chen Pingping or the story this matter involved many years ago. Shi Fei has already brought the Jingdou garrison south, Yi Zhong slowly said. Yi Chong spoke slowly, I only hope that this incident will cause as little commotion as possible. Impossible. Gong Dian very straightforwardly shattered Commander Ye's fantasies. They were all officials of the Qin Kingdom. They all hoped that the Qin Kingdom would be able to maintain stability and harmony while the present situation was good. They all hoped that the Qin Kingdom could move steadily and powerfully toward its most glorious day. However, everyone knew that the battle between the emperor and Chen Pingping would certainly create a large chasm in this country. I don't know what His Majesty is thinking. Yi Chang's expression was steely as he said word by word, I only know that if Your Majesty wants to arrest Director Chen, the director must have done something. Gong Dian shook his head. I don't think so. If the Qin Kingdom's great emperor was like a god in the sunlight, unattainable, dazzling, and ruling over the world, then the Qin Kingdom's great emperor was like a god in the sun. Then, Chen Pingping, who had controlled the Overwatch Council for decades, was like a king in the darkness. He had always carefully hidden behind the emperor's light and helped the emperor complete some things that were inconvenient for him to do. He helped the Qin Kingdom control some things in the darkness. For decades, the Qin court had always advanced in the struggle between the civil official system and the Overwatch Council. Regardless of whether it was the powerful Prime Minister Lin Ruofu or the Hall of Governmental Affairs and Imperial Censorate later, no one could shake Chen Pingping's position in court. No one could decrease the emperor's imperial favor and trust in Qin Pingping. The officials had long gotten used to this and had already given up hope. They thought that the emperor and Qin Pingping were an anomaly between ruler and official. Perhaps they would know each other until their hair turned white and then until they died of old age. It would still be this interweaving of light and darkness. The mutual trust between ruler and official was truly a match made in heaven. That was why Gong Dian was afraid and why Yi Zhong was worried. They didn't dare to imagine how much terrifying energy would be drawn out once the light and darkness clashed. That energy was probably not something that could be resolved by a large army pressing down on a city. Shi Fei, who knew the inside story and was heading southeast of Jingdou, was the person with the heaviest heart. Like Gong Dian, he could not understand why the emperor was acting against old director Qin. The old director had clearly resigned from all his posts and wanted to return to his hometown to retire. Why was the emperor acting now? Most importantly, why was it him? Shi Fei thought of how he was going to face Qin Pingping. Even though he was flying in the warm autumn wind, he couldn't help but shiver. He would rather face the murderous barbarians of Shihu and Shang Shanhu, who used troops like a god in northern Qi, than face the old cripple who only had a few hundred people at his side and a few dozen women. He led 4,000 elite soldiers and had long arrived on a mountain not far from Dazhou. He waited nervously and helplessly for that moment to arrive. Fortunately, the emperor had never made the edict clear. He didn't need to send out troops now. He hoped he would never have to send out troops. He was waiting for the emperor to change his mind so that he could protect his own life. From the moment General Shi Fei left the city to capture Director Qin and bring him back to the capital, he already had the self-awareness to exchange his life for it. He sat on his horse and gazed back in the direction of Jingdou. His eyes narrowed slightly. He secretly prayed that the emperor's final edict would never come. Eunuch Yao stood quietly in the royal study. His trembling words earlier were just his duty as a servant. Like all of the generals, officials, and servants in the Qin kingdom, he also didn't want to see the emperor and Director Qin fall out. After Hong Xiyang, Eunuch Yao, who had become the Qin court's leader, knew too much inside information. He also thought he knew why the emperor had suddenly developed such a powerful killing intent toward Director Qin. Thus, he only stood nervously and uneasily to the side, not daring to say anything. The emperor was still thinking. Earlier, a glimmer of bewilderment had involuntarily risen in his eyes. For him, whose heart was like the sky, this kind of bewilderment was an emotion that hadn't appeared in many years. Perhaps only Qin Pingping, who had accompanied him since he was a child, who had always been loyal to him, who had saved his life many times, opened mountains for the Qin kingdom, and made countless contributions, could cause him to sink into such emotions. A few thin files were placed on the table in front of him. One was the internal court's investigation into the third prince's strange assassination deep in the palace during the Jingdou rebellion. Another was the secret investigation into the Hanging Temple matter, particularly the dispute between the true head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, the Shadow, and Siga Jian in the manner of the master of the city in Dongyi this spring. The third was Fan Xian secretly sending the heavily injured Shadow to Jiangnan. The fourth was the strangeness of the Overwatch Council on the day of the attack on Fan Xian in the valley, as well as the process of when the 2 city-guarding crossbows were shipped out of the 3rd workshop of the palace treasury. The 4th investigation file was the thickest, but the things recorded were also the most vague. The internal court and court had secretly investigated for a full 3 years. In front of the Overwatch Council and under Qin Pingping's purposeful concealment, the Qing Emperor had only found a hint and no concrete evidence. This file talked about the fire in Huichen Hall in Jingdou and the defection of someone in the 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council. The matter pointed straight to the inner palace, the crown prince, the eldest princess, and that stormy night. There was a 5th, 6th, the 3rd prince, the second prince, Qingqian, Yunrui. The emperor's face was slightly pale. He picked up a thin file and placed it to the side. Then, he would say a name. He threw down 4 files and said 4 names. In the end, he picked up a few files. His fingers tightened slightly as he gently placed them to the side. With a sigh, he said, "This is NG." The emperor slowly raised his head. The confusion in his eyes had long disappeared. There was only a faint trace of sorrow and a self-mocking cold smile. My most loyal official once tried to kill all of my sons. Perhaps it should be said that he forced me to kill my sons. His brows furrowed. What surprises me the most is that this old dog didn't even let NG go. If NG's life had not been strong, he would probably have died to his hands long ago. The Qing emperor slowly shook his head and took a deep breath. A cold light flashed through his eyes. Faintly, he said, "Bring that old dog back. I want to ask him what exactly is going on." Eunuch Yao did not dare to say more. He bowed deeply and walked out of the royal study. His legs were about to give out because he understood the emperor's emotions better than anyone else. The emperor's last faint words were filled with too much unstoppable killing intent. As he was about to leave the royal study, the emperor suddenly said coldly, "Send a message to Yan Bingyun. Tell him I am watching him. Then, send a message to Shi Fei. I want him alive." The emperor's expression remained cold. "If that old dog dies, he doesn't need to come back alive to see me." Chapter 688. There were many things to do this month, so I didn't write much, so I didn't have the nerve to ask for votes. Today was the last day of November, so I had to ask for votes no matter what. I hoped that everyone still had votes. I pursed my lips. Next month, I will do my best to ask for votes. This is quite serious. I will write seriously and ask for votes seriously. Because regardless of whether I can finish writing Qing Use Your next month, one thing is for sure, and that is that I will be asking for votes for the last month. I don't know what the situation will be, so I hope that everyone will leave December's votes for me. Of course, I also want today's votes, I like it very much. Chapter 689. At noon, Scholar he placed a hand on his forehead to block the blinding sun. Ignoring the blinding sweat flowing down his face, he quickly left the quiet royal palace. He did not enter the small corner room of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Instead, he boarded the sedan chair and came to the yamen of the Imperial Censorate. Once he entered the yamen, he realized that his official robes had long been soaked in sweat. Dazed, he walked woodenly into the hall and sat alone for a long time before he came to his senses. Previously, His Majesty had summoned him to the imperial study. With just a few simple words, He Zongwei knew that the secret plan he had set up had all fallen into His Majesty's eyes. His Majesty knew what he was investigating, but was too lazy to ask, too lazy to care, and only looked at him coldly. Thinking of this, Scholar He's entire body trembled with fear. After all, his investigation had been somewhat improper. Given the Emperor's intelligent eyes, since he already knew of this matter, how could he not see it? What surprised him was that the Emperor did not harshly reprimand him. He only tiredly gave a few instructions before chasing him out. He Zongwei sank into deep thought in the cool Imperial Censorate yamen. Why was the Emperor not angry? Had the Internal Court and Ministry of Justice actually found something in Dazhou? Was it that tiger guard Gauda or Wang Qinian, who was definitely not dead, who had given himself away? Dazhou was not far from Jingdou, but it took time to send information back and forth. He Zongwei had no other way. He could only wait excitedly and nervously in Jingdou for the report. Until now, he still did not know that his search for Gouda in Dazhou was in line with the will of heaven. It would block the returning director Qin outside the city. At the same time, it would give Qin Pingping an opportunity to act. This was also the emperor's opportunity to act. Not only did He Zongwei not know the inside story of what was happening in Dazhou, who the scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and the Qing officials of the 6 ministries and 3 temples also did not guess that the Qing kingdom was in a state of turmoil. They only smelled something strange. No one connected this smell to the retired director Qin. Even the most intelligent person would not think that problems would occur between the emperor and Qin Pingping. Furthermore, the officials did not even think in this direction. Even the officials of the Overwatch Council had never doubted the old ancestors' loyalty to the Qin kingdom and the emperor. Be loyal to the emperor and do everything for the Qin kingdom. This was the education all the officials and secret agents of the Overwatch Council had received when they first entered the academy. During these decades, with Qin Pingping at the head, all of the black-clothed officials had worked endlessly for this goal, for the strength of the Qin kingdom, and for the emperor's safety. Who would have thought that the Overwatch Council would become one of the emperor's targets? It was precisely because no one had thought of this that there were people who were sensitive enough to probe in that direction. As the most powerful intelligence network and secret service organization in the world, many signs of the strange activity in Jingdo had fallen into the eyes of the officials of the Overwatch Council. In particular, the increase in the level of defense of the Imperial Army, the sudden movement of the Jingdo garrison, and even Scholar He's sudden entry into the palace and dejectedly leaving the palace had all fallen into different eyes. Through different channels, they were all sent back to the square, black-gray building. Other than the 5th Bureau, where the Black Knights were, all of the leading figures of the 8 bureaus were in the black-gray building of the Overwatch Council. The sun had just moved to the west when the intelligence reports had been gathered to the 2nd Bureau. After being sorted out by different intelligence officials, they were then placed on the desk of the head of the 2nd Bureau. The head of the 2nd Bureau was a middle-aged man. He was one of the few old officials of the 8 bureaus who had stayed behind. Ever since Fan Xian became the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and gradually began to take over the power of the Overwatch Council, in order to make his takeover smoother, Qin Pingping began to persuade the old officials of the 8 bureaus to leave. These old officials had single-handedly built this council with Director Qin, so they did not have any conflict with the son of the young lady of the Yi family. Thus, they left naturally and happily. Mu Tai took over the 1st Bureau. Fan Xian's brother-disciple, who used poison, took over the 3rd Bureau. Yan Bingyun took over the 4th Bureau. The commander of the Black Knights had become the silver-masked Jing Gu. The bald head of the 7th Bureau had left a long time ago. The head of the 8th Bureau was someone Fan Xian had picked from the Qinian unit. Only the 2nd Bureau, because of the importance of intelligence reports, was still managed by the old head. He sincerely and dutifully trained his deputy. Once the deputy was able to take over the entire Qin kingdom's intelligence system, he would have this person close to Director Fan take over. The Overwatch Council and Imperial Censorate had been fighting lawsuits. Director Fan Jr. did not like Scholar He, so He Zongwei had always been the focus of the Overwatch Council's secret surveillance. Although the emperor had always been opposed to this kind of surveillance, the court could not keep an eye on the Overwatch Council using the power in their hands to do other things. The middle-aged head of the 2nd Bureau furrowed his brows as he looked at the file in his hand. He didn't know what the emperor had said to He Zongwei for his expression to become so ugly. As for the changes in the Imperial Army and the departure of the Jingdo garrison, they were also sensitive intelligence reports. The head of the 2nd Bureau furrowed his brows and thought for a long time. He still could not understand what power there was around Jingdo that the court needed to deal with so carefully. In particular, the Overwatch Council had not participated in this matter from the beginning. The palace had not even given a word. This was truly very different from before. He picked up the file on the table and coughed. He walked out the door and up the stairs to the quiet secret room. He knocked on the door twice and pushed it open to enter. A young official dressed in white, completely at odds with the sinister atmosphere of the Overwatch Council, was sitting behind the large table and looking intently at something. The head of the second bureau smiled slightly. He looked at Yen Bingyun and sighed in his heart. He then walked forward and placed the file in his hands on the table. The old director had already retired. Sir Fan Jr. had finally become the true director. It was clear that Sir Yen Jr. would not only manage the affairs of the Fourth Bureau. He would probably take over Fan Xian's position as the new commissioner of the Overwatch Council. During these years, Chen Pingping had been recuperating. Fan Xian also did not have the patience to manage the details. Thus, all of the Overwatch Council's affairs had always been shouldered by Yen Bingyun alone. Thus, when Yen Bingyun became the commissioner in charge of the council's miscellaneous matters, the officials of the Overwatch Council were all used to it and would not have any objections. For the old officials of the Overwatch Council, although Sir Fan Jr. was a startling talent and because of the young lady of the Yi family and Director Chen's relationship, they were all loyal to Fan Xian and had great respect for him. However, there was always a distance to this respect. In comparison, Sir Yen Jr., who had grown up in the Overwatch Council and paid a great price for the council in northern Qi, was, without question, closer. "Uncle Lu, what is it that requires you to personally deliver it?" Yen Bingyun smiled warmly, completely without the frosty feeling he had in front of Fan Xian. Standing, he invited the head of the second bureau to sit. He then casually flipped open the files. The movements of the Imperial Army and Jingdo garrison only need to be reported to the Internal Court and Bureau of Military Affairs. It doesn't matter if we don't know about it. The head of the second bureau looked at Yen Bingyun worriedly. But this does not conform to convention. Such a major matter, there must be a purpose. However, the Overwatch Council still does not know what has happened. Yen Bingyun had already flipped through the intelligence reports. The curve of his lips remained steady. Smiling slightly, he said, "It has not been peaceful in Dongyi recently. There are many aces in those places. Furthermore, the Jianghu people are murderous. Perhaps the palace is worried that, like the Hanging Temple that year, a few more killers have snuck in. It is not a big deal for the Imperial Army to raise the level of defense. It is the Jingdo garrison." Yen Bingyun shook his head. "In a moment, send a message to the Bureau of Military Affairs to ask." "The Bureau of Military Affairs can ignore us," the head of the second bureau furrowed his brows and said. Furthermore, the problem now is that Shifei personally led the troops away. It must have been an edict from the palace. He suddenly thought of something. He remembered that Director Chen's carriages had not left Jingdo for long. Immediately, he smiled self-mockingly and shook his head. "What is it?" Yen Bingyun's gaze was deep as he glanced at him unintentionally. "Nothing." The head of the second bureau shook his head and smiled. "I'm really getting old. Sometimes, it's easy for my mind to run wild." He would never have thought that the palace would act against the old director he respected the most. Thus, he unconsciously put an end to his earlier speculations. Just like Gong Dian and Yi Zhong's confusion and General Shifei's unease and fear, no one could have thought of this. Yen Bingyun slowly lowered his head and said, "The council's surveillance of the military has never been a public matter. It is best not to send a message to the Bureau of Military Affairs." "What is the usual method?" "We cannot interfere with the military. Usually, we draft up an intelligence report and send it to the palace for the emperor to look over." The head of the second bureau was silent for a moment and then said, "Of course, we have to react faster to unusual movements like today. All right. Yan Bingyun's head remained lowered. Immediately put this intelligence report into a report and send it through the secret tunnel to the royal study. Yes. The head of the second bureau unconsciously acknowledged like a subordinate. He suddenly felt that Yan Bingyun's reaction was strange. He did not raise his head and appeared rude. He was now an official of the same rank as him. He had not truly taken up the position of commissioner, yet. He shook his head again. He had watched Yan Bingyun grow up and knew he was not like this. He just thought there was something wrong with the Yan manner, so he didn't think more about it. Picking up the file, he left. The opportunity for the Overwatch Council to react at the first instant was lost just like that. In front of the Qing Kingdom's powerful state apparatus, if the Overwatch Council, as a secret agency, did not have any reaction, it might be the best reaction for this country, this court, or even this square black and gray building. The room returned to its unchanging silence for countless years. Yan Bingyun slowly raised his head. If there was someone beside him, they would certainly see the increasing struggle and pain in Sir Yan Jr.'s eyes. Yan Bingyun's hands were clenched tightly under the table and did not loosen for a long time. His thin lips were pressed together tightly, so tightly that there was almost no blood left. He slowly stood up and walked to the side of the window. Lifting the black curtain, he gazed out. With a glance, he saw a corner of the bright yellow royal palace glistening under the clear autumn sunlight. He thought of the first time he entered the Overwatch Council. The old man in the wheelchair had met him in this room. The black cloth on the window seemed to have never been taken down. It was as if the old man was used to the darkness and never saw the sunlight again. Later, the old man left this room and returned to Qin Garden. Fan Xian did not like staying in the Overwatch Council's serious and sinister courtyard every day, so the person who stayed in this room the longest was Yan Bingyun himself. In the past, the heads of the 8 bureaus would report matters to the 2 sides of this long table. Now, there was no one on either side of the long table. In the past, there would always be a wheelchair at the end of the long table. Behind the wheelchair was a patch of shadow. Now, the wheelchair was long gone. Yan Bingyun slowly pulled down the black curtain in his hand and let out a long sigh. The confusion, struggle, and pain in his eyes gradually disappeared. Since he was the second owner of this room, he had to inherit the previous owner's temperament and will. Since he had made up his mind, he could not hesitate. Yan Bingyun was one of the 7 young officials the Qing Emperor had summoned into the palace when he was injecting new blood into the court. These 7 young officials were the new people the Qing Emperor had prepared for the future of the Qing kingdom. Other than Qin Heng, who had died in the rebellion, the other 6 had already begun to shine in the Qing court. Of the 6, the one who had climbed the fastest was He Zhongwei. At such a young age, he was already a traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He also held the position of Imperial Censor of the Left. Yan Bingyun and Qing Jialin, one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, were, without question, grouped into Fan Xian's faction. However, no one knew how much effort and intimidation the Qing Kingdom's mighty emperor had put into the Overwatch Council Sir Yan Jr. during that night's conversation. In the emperor's eyes, the most important of the so-called 7 gentlemen were He Zhongwei and Yan Bingyun. Yan Bingyun slowly sat down and spread his palms flat on the table. Gently, he ran his hands over the Overwatch Council's complicated documents and intelligence reports. Then, he gently rang a bell and summoned in his direct subordinates, as well as the members of the Qinian unit he could use. In a quiet voice, he gave out order after order. These orders did not appear to have any connection to each other and did not draw much attention. However, the reinforcement to Dongyi and the exchange with Deng Ziyu and Shiliang Road would take up most of the Overwatch Council's attention during these dozen days. In total, 4 orders easily emptied most of the Jingdo Overwatch Council's power and began to move them to various places in the Qin Kingdom. These movements were not unusual, so they did not draw anyone's attention. However, with this, it would be difficult for the Overwatch Council to gather a powerful killing force in Jingdo again. There were not many people who could do this. Even if Fan Xian did it himself, he probably would not have done it as quickly as Yan Bingyun. In the end, Fan Xian was not someone who could handle detailed matters. He understood the Overwatch Council very well, but he still did not understand it as thoroughly as Yan Bingyun. For such a large Overwatch Council to be able to create such a result by only moving a few points, Sir Yan Jr.'s planning skills were still as powerful as ever. The only thing that could not be moved was the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council. The First Bureau was responsible for overseeing the governance of Jingdo's officials. Furthermore, the First Bureau had been personally managed by Fan Xian. Although Mu Tai had become the head of the First Bureau, the officials of the First Bureau still felt that their direct superior was the director. Although Yan Bingyun had Fan Xian's orders, he could not use overly bizarre orders to move them out of Jingdo. After Yan Bingyun finished all of this, he took a deep breath. It was as if everything he had just done had almost suffocated him. Everything is for the Qin Kingdom. Yan Bingyun slowly closed his eyes. He couldn't help but think of the conversation he had with his father a long time ago. The corners of his smooth eyes twitched involuntarily. Or is it all for the Overwatch Council? When Eunuch Yao left the royal study and came to the foot of the palace walls to announce the imperial edict to Yi Zhong and Gong Dian, not many people in the royal palace knew of this matter. When Yi Zhong and Gong Dian knelt on the ground and forcefully suppressed the shock and unease in their hearts to receive the edict, Eunuch Yao handed over the emperor's letter and said expressionlessly, "General Shifei is waiting for the edict." Yi Zhong stood up and accepted the emperor's letter. It was as if he had accepted Dong Mountain. It was so heavy that he could barely raise his arm. He was one of the few remaining 9th-level aces in the Qin Kingdom. Faced with this letter, he still felt that he could not bear the burden. Fortunately, the person who truly needed this letter was Shifei, an important official sent by the military from Yanjing. Because he had not been in Jingdo for a long time, he had been sent by the emperor on such a dangerous mission. As the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Zhong couldn't help but feel a wave of sorrow for Shifei. At the same time, a chill rose in his heart. The emperor had sent the military from Yanjing to handle this matter and not the Dingzhou army. Other than the fact that Shifei was leading the Jingdo garrison, it had to be said that Yi Zhong had lived in Jingdo for a long time. The emperor was not at ease with his relationship with Chen Pingping. Yi Zhong understood this, but his expression did not change at all. Eunuch Yao left the imperial army camp empty-handed. With his body hunched, he slowly walked deeper into the palace. Like Yi Zhong, many complicated emotions rose and fell in this head eunuch's heart. After serving in the palace for a long time, he was used to the conversation between the emperor and old director Qin that was completely different from that between ruler and official. He knew that in the emperor's heart, old director Qin was not just a normal official. Thinking of the emperor's angry scene in the royal study, the smile on Eunuch Yao's face involuntarily became bitter. In his opinion, if the emperor truly wanted to punish old director Qin, then wouldn't it have been more convenient for the emperor to take action in Jingdo when the old director had entered the palace to bid farewell? Why did he have to wait until old director Qin had already left the capital and was on his way home before taking action? The matter was in Dazhou. The Tiger Guard who had escaped before the battle was in Dazhou. The Ministry of Justice aces that scholar he had sent were in Dazhou. The aces that the internal court had sent to help the imperial censorate were also in Dazhou. Eunuch Yao understood the emperor's intentions better than anyone. It looked like the emperor was still watching. Eunuch Yao knew that if old director Qin truly wanted to escape, unless the emperor personally led troops to chase after him, no one would be able to stop that strange old creature. He walked to Taiji Palace and leaned against the side of a pillar, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The eunuchs and serving girls who passed him bowed respectfully and slightly fearfully and then silently left. Eunuch Yao closed his eyes and enjoyed the early autumn afternoon sunlight. He sighed to himself and said to himself, "Old director, since you've left, don't come back. The emperor also doesn't want you to come back." After the cold-blooded and heartless Qing emperor had secretly investigated for a long time, he still went against his nature and gave Chen Pingping a chance to defend himself, and a chance to leave. Before Chen Pingping left, he did not defend himself. Now, outside Dazhou, he had run into Tiger Guard Gouda, who was wanted by the court. It all depended on whether or not he was willing to leave. If Chen Pingping was willing to leave, perhaps this matter would be over. If he was not willing to leave, then he would have to return to Jingdou. This was not the Qing emperor's affection for Chen Pingping. It was probably more of an interrogation, questioning, and quiet questioning of Chen Pingping's heart. The Qing emperor and Chen Pingping had known and accompanied each other for decades. He could accept anyone betraying him because a paranoid emperor never trusted anyone in the world. However, he could not accept Chen Pingping betraying him. He didn't even believe any of the truths he had discovered. When a person lived in this world, they were always afraid of being alone, particularly the person sitting on the throne. Perhaps the Qing emperor himself did not realize that Chen Pingping, this seemingly lonely old cripple, was the only source of warmth in his cold heart that could prove he was a living person. Thus, the emperor was angry and worried. Until the end, he still looked at himself and Chen Pingping's heart with a glimmer of uncertainty. Those closely involved could not see clearly. Perhaps the only person who could see all of this clearly was the head eunuch leaning against a pillar in Taiji Palace and basking in the sun. Eunuch Hong liked to bask in the sun. Eunuch Yao also liked to bask in the sun. Eunuch Ho, who had died to Fan Xian's hand, also liked to bask in the sun. It was probably because these abnormal people hid too many secrets in their hearts. Their eyes were more sinister than anyone else's, allowing them to know too much about the emperor's joys, anger, sorrow, and joy. However, they could not say it or think about it. Thus, they could only allow the sun to shine endlessly on their bodies to prevent the secrets in their bodies from becoming moldy and the icy emotions from frostbite them. Eunuch Yao closed his eyes and slowly breathed. He was not a powerful warrior like Hong Xiyang. He also did not have the noble spirit to sacrifice himself for the Qing kingdom's unification of the world. He was just a cautious and careful person. All of his goals were to ensure that he could live on safely. Thus, other than fear, he had no other thoughts regarding the matter between the emperor and old director Qin. "The sun is truly quite good today," Eunuch Dai said with a smile as he walked out from the side of the hall and leaned against him. Eunuch Yao smiled and glanced at his old companion. The two of them had entered the palace together. However, Eunuch Dai's days in the palace had not been as peaceful as his. Eunuch Dai had first been in Lady Shu's palace and had been deeply favored by the emperor. The important matters of passing edicts to officials' manners were all given to him to do. Later, he lost power in one day and did miserably in the palace. It was not until Sir Fan Jr.'s help and his outstanding performance during the palace rebellion that he once again made a name for himself in the palace. All of the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace were afraid of Eunuch Yao. After all, he was the head eunuch closest to the emperor. However, Eunuch Dai did not have the fear that most people had. After all, he was an old acquaintance. Furthermore, Eunuch Dai's power was not small. Behind him was Sir Fan Jr. Eunuch Yao did not reply. He only moved to the side and gave him half of the corridor pillar's position. Eunuch Dai glanced at him. He wanted to say something but then stopped. Instead, he sighed and said, "When we first entered the palace, we were lazy and sunbathing here. In the end, we were beaten 50 times by Eunuch Hong. Do you still remember?" Of course, Eunuch Yao remembered. Among the young eunuchs at the time, the young marquis had already died. He sighed. He knew what old Dai wanted to ask. Presumably, he had also sensed the strangeness in the royal palace today. However, this matter was too big. In the entire world, probably only 5 people knew about it. Furthermore, Eunuch Dai and Sir Fan Jr. had a good relationship, so this matter had to be hidden from him. Eunuch Yao smiled and narrowed his eyes as he glanced at the sun to his left. Of the companions of the past, in the end, some died and some scattered. How many of them are like you and I who still remember the friendship of being beaten together? We are still alive. As long as we are alive, that is good. Eunuch Dai shook his head. Eunuch Yao suddenly raised his head and gazed toward the end of the long corridor. He saw a young eunuch slowly walking over with his back hunched. He narrowed his eyes and said, "Hongzhu has been following you recently. How is he?" This child probably suffered a great shock 3 years ago. He's become more and more taciturn. Eunuch Dai clearly liked the clever and taciturn young eunuch. He sighed and said, "Back then, he was also a popular person in the Eastern Palace. Who would have thought that he would end up like this? Back then, he also served in the royal study." "Being taciturn is also a good thing," Eunuch Yao said calmly. "Back then, you also talked too much." Eunuch Dai smiled self-mockingly and didn't say anything more. 2 days later, in a mountain on the outskirts of Dazhou, the Jingdo garrison, which had just rested for less than a day, received an urgent secret report from the Bureau of Military Affairs in Jingdo. Shi Fei accepted the secret letter and destroyed the wax at the mouth of the letter. He read the contents of the letter word by word. His pupils constricted slightly and then returned to normal. He was not silent for long before he handed the letter to the soldier beside him. "Take this letter well. You are not allowed to show yourself tomorrow. If I die, give this letter to Sir Fan Jr." Thousands of Jingdo garrison riders were waiting in the valley. General Shi Fei only brought the soldiers beside him to stand under the setting sun and watch the activity in Dazhou not far ahead. The soldier was slightly shocked. He thought that the Yanjing army had never had any connection to Sir Fan Jr. or even the Overwatch Council. Why was this letter so important? Shi Fei laughed coldly and didn't explain anything. He looked at his subordinates at the bottom of the valley. He had no confidence in his heart. Even he didn't know whether or not there were spies planted by the Overwatch Council among the Jingdo garrison soldiers. Although the court had clearly decreed that the Overwatch Council's regulations strictly forbade the Overwatch Council from infiltrating the military, what kind of person was General Shi Fei? He did not believe this at all. Even a major figure like the old Qin master had fallen to the hands of an Overwatch Council spy. Shi Fei did not think he was more powerful than Qin Yi. He took a deep breath and said, "Slow down and move closer in the direction of Dazhou." He was afraid that he would fail and die. He was even more afraid that once he died, the emperor, in order to appease Sir Fan Jr.'s emotions, would put the crime of killing Director Qin on him. Thus, he handed the emperor's letter to his soldier. If he failed this time, then this letter had to be delivered to Fan Xian's hands. Chapter 690. Dazhou in the night, surrounded by torches, and filled with sparks in the sky and on the ground. Dazhou was not much darker than day. The previous director of the Overwatch Council, the Qing Emperor's most loyal servant and closest official, Chen Pingping, sat in his wheelchair. He looked at the people kneeling on the ground and kowtowing to him on both sides of the road. The expression on his face did not tremble at all. The fine and deep wrinkles did not bloom into the shape of a chrysanthemum. Instead, they coldly spread out. It was like a shocking scene formed on a yellow plain after being washed by rain for thousands of years. His withered and old hands slowly stroked across the wool blanket. This light gray wool blanket was always smooth and comfortable. Each time he stroked it, Chen Pingping always felt that he was stroking something he did not have the good fortune to touch. It did not take long for him to learn from the internal court eunuch what had happened in Dazhou. He also learned who the court criminal being protected by the Overwatch Council subordinates and being treated was. Gauda. Chen Pingping was not familiar with this name, but he was not a stranger either. He knew that it was Fan Xian's trusted bodyguard. He glanced at the blood-covered criminal of the imperial court, and his cold eyes gradually narrowed. The Overwatch Council did not know that Gauda was still alive. Chen Pingping sighed in his heart. He thought to himself that even the leader of the Tiger Guards had been turned by Fan Xian into someone who valued his life. Although Enji usually appeared indifferent and uninteresting in his conduct, unexpectedly, he had such magic in the fine details. Just as Chen Pingping had said to himself earlier, Qiao Qiao's mother had actually given birth to Qiao Qiao. This was not a very coincidental matter. Rather, it was preordained by cause and effect. The events of the past were preordained, and then they landed here. Just like how the convoy of 30 black carriages of the Overwatch Council was passing through Dazhou as normal. Outside Dazhou, they ran into the court's entourage searching for an imperial criminal. The criminal the court was searching for was one of Fan Xian's people. This was not a coincidence, nor was it a chance encounter. Perhaps there was something hidden behind all of this. Sir, he was actually able to find an escaped imperial criminal. How impressive, Chen Pingping said with a slight smile. Chen Pingping coughed twice and said with a smile. Behind him, the old servant who never left his side pushed his wheelchair towards the center of the crowd. As the wheelchair rolled on the official road, it made a heart-palpitating sound. The internal court eunuch He Qigan had a very high status in the palace. However, his personality was sinister and he had never been liked by the nobles in the palace. So his status was not very important. However, having suffered in the imperial palace for decades, he naturally knew what kind of attitude he should display at this time. He led the 2 eunuchs and the aces from the Ministry of Justice's 13 yamens to disperse the encirclement. He was afraid that Director Qin would think that they were hostile. He Qigan knew what kind of terrifying figure old Director Qin was. He had never hoped that since they had met Director Qin today, if he gave the order, they would still be able to take the imperial court criminal away. Of course, from another perspective, he did not think that the old director, who had already retired, would go against the emperor's decree for such an insignificant court criminal. After all, the old director was the emperor's most loyal subordinate. However, he had overlooked 2 things. First, Chen Pingping knew that Gauda was Fan Xian's person. Fan Xian never liked other people coming to deal with his people, even if those so-called other people were people sent by the palace. Second, Chen Pingping was immersed in a complicated emotion. He looked at the unconscious court criminal Gauda on the ground and thought about things that bystanders could not understand. The Overwatch Council's treatment was very effective. Gauda finally slowly woke up from the pool of blood. He should not have been able to withstand such heavy injuries. However, in order to protect his wife and child, a few knife wounds had cut deep into his flesh. All of them had been forcefully received by his body and arms. As soon as he woke up, his eyes were pierced by the torches around him. Gauda's dry lips moved slightly. He then saw the black wheelchair close to him, as well as the important figure in it. He hadn't seen old Director Chen many times, but he knew what kind of person he was, especially after seeing old Director Chen's slightly worried and complicated gaze. The mute woman saw that her husband had woken up and was overjoyed. Holding the child, she half knelt by his side and repeatedly nodded her thanks to the Overwatch Council officials around her. This commoner woman did not know how delicate the current situation was. She also did not know that whether or not to save him was actually just a prelude to the major events to come. It all depended on what Chen Pingping did. Gao Da's expression darkened. He knew that if Chen Pingping kept his life for Sir Fan Jr.'s sake, then he Zhongwei could use this matter to drag Fan Xian and even Chen Pingping down with him. His finger moved slightly. A ruthless light flashed through his eyes. He bent his finger and tapped it against his temple. He wanted to escape earlier because he was alone with his wife and child. Even when faced with the powerful machinery of the Qin Kingdom, he still wanted to stubbornly live on until the day he could no longer live on. However, he wanted to commit suicide now because he knew that if he lived, he would give Chen Pingping, or more accurately, Sir Fan Jr., who Chen Pingping wanted to protect, a difficult problem. Thus, he chose to commit suicide. Chen Pingping watched him take action and did not have any reaction. There was only a glimmer of admiration flashing through his eyes, as well as a knowing smile flashing across his face. With a slap, the Overwatch Council official who had been standing guard by Gao Da's side the entire time easily stopped Gao Da's thought of committing suicide. He gazed at Gao Da and coldly said, "It's not easy to live for another 3 years. You already have a wife and child. Why are you in such a hurry to die?" This voice was very familiar. Gao Da's heart jumped slightly. With great difficulty, he turned his head to look. He did not expect to see a completely unfamiliar face. However, the Overwatch Council official returned to his original tone of voice. Adding to the familiar teasing light in his eyes, Gao Da immediately knew the other party's identity. Gao Da's dry lips moved slightly, but he could not speak. He looked at the Overwatch Council official like he was looking at a ghost. After a long time, he said in a low voice, crying and laughing, "So, you are also alive." The Overwatch Council official smiled slightly and tightened the strips of cloth on his body. Patting his hand, he said, "Who doesn't want to live? With the director here, your life and death is not up to you to decide." Chen Pingping leaned tiredly against the black wheelchair. The Qin garden women on both sides of the carriages had dispersed into the woods to relieve themselves. Fortunately, the shameful voices did not come over. However, the teasing voices gradually grew louder. The old man narrowed his eyes and looked at Gao Da. "You are not Gao Da." Gao Da's heart jumped. He looked at Director Chen with confusion. Chen Pingping slowly said, "You are only a minor figure. Your life and death is not a major matter, so it is best if you are alive." After these words were said, not only Gao Da and the Overwatch Council official beside him, but even the Ministry of Justice aces scattered around, as well as He Qigan and the other 3 internal court eunuchs, sensed something strange. Tiger Guard Gao Da, who had escaped in the face of battle, was a court criminal that scholar he had been secretly searching for a long time. In the eyes of the Overwatch Council, or, more accurately, in Chen Pingping's eyes, he was just an unremarkable minor figure. He Qigan silently took 2 steps back. The Dazhou Zhizhou nervously moved over with small steps and bowed solemnly to Chen Pingping. He then invited the old director into the city to rest. The Overwatch Council was a secret service organization. It was the organization that all officials feared and hated the most. It was also the organization they wanted to establish a relationship with the most. From Chen Pingping to Fan Xian, these 2 people were powerful people who did not need to build relationships in court. Thus, the civil officials of the Qin Kingdom never found any opportunities. Without question, this was a great opportunity for the Dazhou Zhizhou to curry favor with old Director Qin and continue to curry favor with the Duke. As an official, he did not want to pass up this opportunity no matter what. As for the court criminal, that was the business of the internal court and Ministry of Justice officials. It had nothing to do with him. Chen Pingping paid no attention to this official. He only looked coldly at Gouda, thinking about his own matters. Just as he said earlier, Chen Pingping did not think that Gao Da's sudden appearance was a coincidence. He Zhongwei's secret investigation of Gouda and Wang Qinian could perhaps be hidden from the Overwatch Council, but it could not be hidden from the Emperor. Why did the Emperor choose to have this matter explode on his way back? It was for a reason, an excuse, and an inquiry. The Emperor was far away in Jingdou, separated by thousands of li, and was questioning Chen Pingping. He was using the matter of the court criminal's life to question Chen Pingping. Were you my black dog or a powerful official with your own will? Powerful officials never had good endings. Even someone like Lin Ruofu, who had seen the opportunity and retreated cleanly and completely hid in Wuzhou to be a farmer, still had to be afraid at all times that the emperor would be unhappy one day. Chen Pingping was not a normal official. He did not need to worry about these things. He knew the emperor only wanted to ask him a question and then see his attitude toward the emperor. Chen Pingping suddenly smiled. His smile was slightly strange. Under the blowing of the night wind and the illumination of the torches, it was like the endlessly blooming golden chrysanthemums under the hanging temple, unafraid of the cold wind and ignoring the mundane world as they bloomed in full bloom. Let Gouda recover, he said with a slight smile as he gently stroked the arms of the wheelchair. The dozens of people the court had sent from Jingdou to capture the criminal, as well as the hundreds of bailiffs and soldiers from Dazhou, heard these light words and felt a chill in their hearts at the same time. They knew Director Qin had decided to interfere. Although they did not dare to resist and were powerless to resist the Overwatch Council swordsmen and secret agents in the 30 black carriages, as well as the power hidden in the darkness, they still felt shocked. If Chen Pingping wanted to protect this person, the emperor would probably have to give him this face. He Qigong and the aces of the 13 Yamans all thought this. Their expressions were very ugly and awkward. However, not a single person dared to express any opposition to Chen Pingping's words. Opposition was ineffective. Opposition was useless. He Qigong's throat was dry. He was not satisfied. He had been sent by the internal court to scholar. He sighed and wandered through Qin Kingdom's Chaojun for a year. He was about to capture Gouda, but in an instant, He Qigong thought helplessly that even if he failed this mission, after he returned to the capital, as long as he told the main official and the head eunuch that it was Director Qin who had interfered, what did it have to do with him? The sweet and witty Qin garden beauties finally returned. They opened their eyes wide and looked curiously at the people surrounded by torches. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know what their master was saying or thinking, but they were not worried. Regardless of whether it was in Qin Garden, during the guerrilla warfare during the Jingdou Rebellion, or now on the road back home, they always had people from the Overwatch Council at their side to protect them. Regardless of which department the officials were, they were all very polite to them. They were all orphan girls Chen Pingping had bought from poor people. Other than being beautiful and able to sing good songs, they had no other strengths. However, Chen Pingping was willing to raise them and protect them. This kind of eccentricity also created these flowers in a greenhouse. If Chen Pingping, this large mountain, fell, no one knew what kind of fate these flowers in a greenhouse would meet. Chen Pingping lowered his head and listened to the familiar women's voices not far behind him. He smiled slightly. He did not have the group of carriages follow the Dazhou Zhizhou's invitation into the city to spend the night. Instead, he sat calmly in his wheelchair and looked at the complicated expressions of the internal court eunuchs and Ministry of Justice officials around him. It was as if he was thinking about something and waiting for something. Then, he closed his eyes. There were not many people in this world who understood the Qing Emperor as well as Chen Pingping did. Gao De was indeed a minor figure. Even as a touchstone, he did not have that kind of hardness. However, the human heart was always a subjective thing. It was as if the emperor was saying to Chen Pingping in the dark mountains, "This criminal is the stone I left for you." There were many choices placed in front of Chen Pingping. He could save Gao De and then leisurely return home. Although he knew that some people would immediately come before him, just as Yi Zhong and Uniqiao thought, in the mountains of the Qin kingdom, who could stop Chen Pingping? He could ignore Gao Da's life and death and take the women and the carriages back home to retire and live out the rest of his life. The emperor gave Chen Pingping one last chance to choose. Regardless of which one Chen Pingping chose, perhaps it was something the emperor wanted to see. The emperor knew that if Chen Pingping did not want to return to Jingdo to face him again, then no one could force him to return to Jingdo to face him. Chen Pingping did not move. The atmosphere on the two sides of the road became more and more strange. Many people could already see that Chen Pingping seemed to be waiting for something. Was someone else coming? The Overwatch Council official who had been standing guard by Gao Da's side walked to the side of the wheelchair and lowered his body to quietly say something by Chen Pingping's ear. Chen Pingping slowly shook his head. He shook his head slowly but firmly. Before long, voices gradually rang out from the back of the road. These voices were not very noisy. On the contrary, they carried a cautious tone. The Overwatch Council officials did not stop this group. Instead, they cautiously used their gazes to escort them to the center of the circle of torches. The Dazhou Zhizhou, He Qigan, and the other internal court eunuchs and officials of the Ministry of Justice finally saw this group clearly. They finally knew who Director Chen was waiting for. Other than shock, they couldn't help but feel a chill. Director Chen had long known what was going to happen. If this was a large chessboard, then He Qigan, the internal court eunuchs, the officials of the Ministry of Justice who had worked hard for a long time, and even He Zhongwei, who had laid out this plan in the beginning, were all unremarkable chess pieces on the chessboard. The people He Zhongwei had sent did not have an imperial edict in their hands. The Overwatch Council's interference could not be considered disobeying the edict. Given Chen Pingping's position, there was no problem. However, the imperial edict had finally arrived. It was like a red team suddenly jumping a horse onto the back of an elephant and then asking the old black general, "Do you want to move or kill the horse?" There were no eunuchs announcing the edict in the small group of a dozen or so people. These Qing soldiers wore armor and were unusually valiant. However, they all wore complicated emotions on their faces. The leader of the small group held the bright yellow imperial edict high in his hand. The sound of horse hooves broke the silence outside Dazhou. All of the soldiers dismounted in unison and bowed solemnly toward Chen Pingping in the wheelchair. The leader of the small group holding the imperial edict began to read the emperor's edict in a trembling voice. The edict had nothing to do with Chen Pingping, who had returned to his hometown to retire. It was only directed at the court criminal Gao De in the Overwatch Council carriage. It ordered the Ministry of Justice to immediately bring this traitor who deceived the emperor back to the capital. No one was to stop him. Otherwise, he would be punished with treason. After the reading of the edict, it was so quiet that one could hear the sound of water dripping from the grass not far away. Everyone's gaze turned fearfully toward the old man in the wheelchair. Even the stupidest person could see that something was wrong. How could there be such a coincidence in the world? Just now, the Overwatch Council had said that the internal court did not have an imperial edict. Now, the imperial edict had appeared in Dazhou. The Dazhou Zhizhou unconsciously took a step back. Everyone unconsciously took a step back. They finally knew that this scene was actually a game between the Emperor and Director Qin. They did not have the right to participate in this matter. They didn't even have the right to take a look. The leader finished reading the imperial edict in a trembling voice and put the bright yellow cloth back into his clothes. He then walked to the front of the wheelchair and knelt down on one knee. In a low voice, he said, "I am the Deputy General of the Jingdo Garrison, Guan Xiong. Following General Shi's orders, I have come to assist the Ministry of Justice of the Internal Court in capturing the court criminal. Please make things easier for me, old director." Chen Pingping's face was slightly pale. He knew that this scene would eventually come. In the end, the Emperor had not completely blocked off the final path. However, perhaps that was because the Emperor had long known that he would block off this path himself. It was still the same old saying. This matter had arisen because of Gouda, but it had nothing to do with him. It was just a mutual question between him and the Emperor. In the distant mountains, it was all quiet. All of the horses were chewing. The Qin Kingdom's warhorses had been trained very well. They didn't even make a sound when they stepped on the ground. Thousands of elite riders of the Jingdo garrison were waiting in this valley, waiting for the final order to launch the attack. Thousands of armored riders charging toward the 30 black carriages on the road should not be a difficult mission. Regardless of whether it was General Shi Fei, standing at the very front, or the Jingdo garrison soldiers behind him who already knew the inside story, they all felt that this was perhaps the most difficult battle of their lives. Shi Fei sat quietly on the back of his horse and put down the telescope in his hand. He did not forget that the Qin Kingdom only produced a few pairs of this telescope. The one in his hand was a gift from Sir Fan Jr. during the New Year. Shi Fei had experienced countless battles in his life. He could truly be said to be someone who had been through hundreds of battles. 3 years ago, the Dongshan Road in the capital was in chaos. The commander of the Northern Expedition Camp, Yan Xiaoyi, rebelled and led thousands of soldiers to surround the Great Dong Mountain. The entire Northern Expedition Camp sank into chaos. Although the rebellion failed and the Northern Expedition Camp was like a group of dragons without a leader, it was very likely that a mutiny or defeat would occur. At that time, Shi Fei received the Emperor's important orders and entered the Northern Expedition Camp alone. With an imperial edict, he subdued tens of thousands of soldiers. It was because of this great service that he became the present commander of the Jingdo garrison. One person could subdue tens of thousands of people. Now, thousands of people were going to deal with an old man in a wheelchair who could not move easily. Shi Fei was still very nervous. The group announcing the edict had already left. Shi Fei prayed in his heart that Director Qin would retreat in front of the imperial edict. For some reason, he knew that Chen Pingping would not retreat, not even by a single step. This was a very strange feeling. Perhaps the Emperor knew that Chen Pingping did not want to retreat, so he had left a path of retreat for him. He didn't know what had happened between the Emperor and Director Qin, but he knew that it must have been deeply entangled between the two of them. Even though Director Qin was about to retire, it forced the two of them to choose to fight face to face. The road illuminated by the torches seemed to sink into a kind of silence. Then, Chen Pingping seemed to slowly shake his head again. Shi Fei took a deep breath. The cold wind in the valley entered his lungs and made him feel a bit cold. He slowly pulled down the mask on his face and said in a heavy voice, "Get ready." Thousands of armored soldiers began to prepare to surround the former director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping. "The Emperor wants me to go back and ask me some things." Chen Pingping sat in the wheelchair and said with a smile, "This is something I have long thought of, but I didn't expect that he would wait until now to ask about it. I also didn't expect that after asking about it, so many things would happen." He shook his head and sighed. "The Emperor still doesn't understand me well enough. The Overwatch Council official suddenly knelt down by his side and gritted his teeth. You must follow the edict. No, I've been following edicts my entire life. Now that I'm going to die, what more should I follow? Chen Pingping smiled. The Emperor wants to ask me some things. How could I not want to ask him some things face to face? Then, his face became cold, and his gaze became icy. Looking at the hundreds of people illuminated by the torches, he said in an icy voice, in one's life, there are always some questions that have been lingering in one's mind for a long time that must be asked. With these words, the sound of hooves thundered outside Dazhou. The shadows of armor reflected the moon. In an instant, it suppressed the light of the torches. A patch of dust rose in the dark night behind the road. In just a few breaths, it had come near the line of carriages. Thousands of armored soldiers spread out silently and fiercely. Everyone's faces turned deathly pale as they stared blankly at this scene. As for the delicate women in the caravan, they couldn't help but scream in fright when they saw this scene. Chen Pingping's expression did not change as he sat in his wheelchair. However, a mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. He didn't speak. None of the Overwatch Council subordinates acted. They only gripped the handles of the metal rods tightly. Their fingers curled around the rings of the crossbows as they stared nervously at the riders charging toward them from the fields on either side of the road. What was different from normal battles was that the thousands of riders did not use this momentum to charge directly into the carriages and begin a slaughter. Instead, they willingly gave up the advantage of the riders' momentum and slowed down at the last moment. They only formed into 3 sharp points and surrounded the 30 carriages. Thousands of armored cavalrymen marched on the black official road, under the red torches, and under the silver moon, forming a terrifying scene. It was a murderous scene. The old servant pushed his wheelchair and slowly turned around. Chen Pingping rested his chin on the armrest and looked at the general hidden from head to toe in armor in the fields beside the road. Smiling slightly, he said, "You want to capture me with just 3,600 people? General Shi, are you looking down on me too much?" Riding on his horse, Shi Fei struggled in his heart. He didn't give his subordinates an immediate order to charge because he hoped the situation could still take a turn for the better. He was not willing to completely fall out with the Overwatch Council like this. He didn't know what Chen Pingping had up his sleeves and didn't care about them. He had to consider what kind of wretched fate awaited him in the future if he was loyal to the Emperor and became a mortal enemy of the Overwatch Council. He was afraid of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian, but he was even more afraid of the Emperor. That was why he had come today but still hadn't taken action. Hearing Director Chen's words, his body on the horse trembled slightly. In a raspy and pained voice, he said, "Director, if you resist the edict and take in an imperial criminal, I will have no choice but to..." Before he could finish, Chen Pingping had already frowned and smiled. As expected, it's always a problem of officials disobeying the imperial edict, and not a problem of the monarch sending troops to ambush an old official who has returned home. He sighed and said, "Our Majesty, even at such a time, has not forgotten to maintain his grand and righteous image. Naturally, a shady character like me naturally has to play my role well." Out of the 30 carriages, other than the carriages carrying luggage and women, the Overwatch Council escorts totaled less than 100 people. However, it was these 100 Overwatch Council officials who faced the Jingdo garrison's 3,000 riders that did not show any signs of retreat. Their expressions were as cold as always. Shi Fei watched this scene quietly and sighed in his heart. The Overwatch Council only had eyes for Director Qin. Where was the Emperor? Faced with the Emperor's edict, these Overwatch Council officials only knew to protect the director's safety. They didn't even need to think about it. No wonder the Emperor was so afraid of this matter. Shadows swayed faintly in the woods on either side of the road. No one knew how many assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council were inside. Fei suddenly felt a glimmer of coldness. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and leaned against the wheelchair. It was as if he was about to fall asleep in the night wind. Regarding the matter of naming the children, thank you for everyone's trust. Many readers have made similar requests, but I have never dared to accept them because I know my standards are very poor. Thinking of Ping Ping, Sua Sua, Dien Dien, Duo Duo, Cici, Ruoruo, Do Do. Does anyone still dare to let me name them? I scratched my head. In the past, I had given a few names to my friends' children, such as Yiwen and Yusu. Other than the latter, the first few were all cursed, particularly after the children grew up. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.